on that. So these are variations of the ETH. Next slide, please. The United States Air Force, and this is something where I really dove into this subject back in the 1990s. I can tell you the United States Air Force absolutely had many strong factions within it that also considered the extraterrestrial hypothesis as the logical solution to UFOs. Again, their phrase was not extraterrestrial, but interplanetary, same thing. That's an illustration from a case from 1948. Again, I'm sure many of the researchers here are familiar with this, the Charles Whitted case in summer of 48. Early 1948, where a rocket, a something, zoomed in front of a commercial airplane, and two qualified pilots described it. That report and the summation of other reports from 1948 made it to the desk of the Air Force Chief of Staff, Hoyt Vandenberg. The report they gave was known as the estimate of the situation, and the estimate was that these were interplanetary craft. And Vandenberg said, no, I don't really like that conclusion. He broke up the team, and the word came out that, no, we're not going to go with the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But this was absolutely, and continued through the 1940s and 50s and 60s and beyond. The US military consistently returned to this hypothesis. They never officially, openly, obviously, endorsed it, but this was absolutely something that was discussed. Next slide. And then you go into deeper, unconfirmed, let us say, secrets, whether we're talking about Roswell. Some researchers don't believe that Roswell was an anomalous extraterrestrial event. I do. Some do not. Then there are other leaks, very contentious, to say the least, the so-called majestic documents. I've gone back and forth on those over the years. If you print out all the majestic documents, not just the original ones from the 1980s, but all of them, it's about this thick. And I know because I printed them out and I read them a couple of times. If they're hoaxes, they're really, really amazingly done hoaxes, and very sophisticated. Maybe they are. I don't really know that they're all hoaxes. I'm still, my door is open on that one. I talk about remote viewing here as another form of evidence. Again, some people, we have different opinions on that. I had the pleasure to know some of the most excellent remote viewers in American history. Ingo Swann, who passed away. I knew Ingo, and Joe McMoneagle, who's still around, Lynn Buchanan, others. There's no question in my mind that these individuals who work for the US intelligence community were really good at what they did, and they were able accurately to see things that there's no logical Newtonian materialistic explanation for. There's something about the nature of our reality, and I will be discussing this later in this lecture, that is not along our normal causality, our normal kind of materialistic physics. And these remote viewers, in my view, are evidence that there's something more complex to our reality. In any case, I think almost every single remote viewer that I can think of has claimed to have bumped into extraterrestrials in one form or another through the remote viewing. When you look at all of these sort of unconventional forms of evidence, they also point to an extraterrestrial hypothesis. That's why I'm mentioning all of this. And incidentally, I met earlier today with Paul Dean. I'm sure many of you know Paul. This was my first meeting with him. He's an Australian researcher, very brilliant guy, who is one of the most expert document analysts that I've met in this field. And he showed me a number of recently declassified documents. He's working with two American researchers, Brad Sparks and Barry Greenwood. And they are continuing to declassify a lot of US documents. And they are finding that right up into this decade, the US military absolutely is still monitoring UFOs. And I was really excited to talk with him, and I'll be diving into his blog site and extracting every little bit of data that I can out of it. I'm embarrassed that I haven't known about what they were doing until now, but I've realized it's impossible for me to keep on top of everything. I just do my best. The point is that the extraterrestrial angle is still actively being considered, and it's really not surprising when you look at all of these different ways of going into it. Next slide, please. So, right, what's the problem? If everything looks like it's an extraterrestrial answer, then why am I even talking about this? Why is this a big deal? Next slide, please. Well, because, there have been some real problems with it. First of all, we don't really have any confirmation of anything. There hasn't been the, day the Earth stood still moment where extraterrestrials land on either in Canberra or Washington or wherever and say, take me to your leader. That has not happened. It would be nice, I suppose, maybe, but it hasn't happened. The early writers in the 50s were wondering, will we be invaded? A lot of the Americans in particular, I think they had a guilty conscience. After all, we came into our country, wiped out the indigenous people. Maybe they were afraid that the extraterrestrials were going to do the same to us, or they're going to invade. That's what we do. We invade. But it didn't happen. And instead, what they discovered as the 1960s turned into the 1970s and beyond is that this is a very strange subject. I was just having a great conversation with some of us earlier this afternoon about the very fact of high strangeness in this field and how this phenomenon doesn't really respond logically. You could have two witnesses next to each other saying what seems to be something different from each other. They'll describe it differently. Why is that? Why is it that these objects, if that's what they are, seem to melt into and melt out of our reality at times? Why is it that there are these time discrepancies that people experience at times when they experience UFOs? Why is it that our emotions seem all out of whack when we have these encounters? Somehow they affect us. Why is it that at times there seems to be telepathic connections with these? I myself had a UFO sighting 17 years ago. I've occasionally talked about it. I was with my son, who was 3 at the time. Perfectly sunny day, no clouds, and I saw, other than the sun, the brightest object I've ever seen in the daytime sky, ever, to this day. And I saw what I thought was the most intensely reflective aircraft ever. I thought, wow, what is this thing that's reflecting just so that it's so bright in my eyes? So I just stood there and looked at it. And then I had this odd thought in my mind, which was, if you look away from this, you'll never see it again. Why would I think that? There was, even if it had lost its reflection, there's nowhere it could have hidden. There were no clouds. It was not that high up in the sky. I would have seen it. But I had this idea, don't look away, don't look away. The problem was my son, who was 3 years old, was demanding my attention, So I thought, okay, I'm going to be a dad for a moment. And I pointed to hold that thing's place in the sky with my finger. And literally for 1 second, turned to my son and I said, I'm watching something. And I turned back and it was just gone. Now, and I laughed, but I was frustrated as hell because I thought, I want to see this thing. I don't know what that was. I don't know if that was a little demonstration for me. Sometimes I have wondered that. But I do feel that there was some way that it got into my head. And I've talked with countless witnesses, this is the case. So my point is, relating to the ETH, maybe they are extraterrestrial, but there's something more going on than simply mechanical nuts and bolts, whatever this is. Men, or maybe a few women in metal spaceships coming from another planet or galaxy or whatever. There's more going on than simply that, like a 1950s version of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Next slide. The statement by the physicist Enrico Fermi, where is everybody? This is at Los Alamos Labs, one during a lunchtime break, I think. And some of the scientists were sitting around just chatting about the likelihood or not likelihood of extraterrestrial life in the universe. Even in the early Cold War era, this was discussed, and Fermi says, yeah, well, so where is everyone? Somewhat offhandedly. But that phrase has become a tagline in a sense. Where is everyone? Well, what I would say to the skeptics who ask that is read a few good UFO reports. There's someone that's here doing something. But the question is valid if you want to really go into the skeptical hypothesis, which is the next slide, if you would hit that, please. So this is one alternative hypothesis, and we're all familiar with the skeptics. That's Donald Menzel on your top left, Philip J. Klass next to him, Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson. 4 Americans. I'm sure the Aussies have their own versions of this. I'm trying to think of some hardcore skeptics here. I'm sure they're out there. These are very prominent ones. And, their argument is pretty straightforward. This is all a big mistake, people. Don't bother wasting your time. It's all hoaxes, hallucinations. There are logical explanations for every UFO sighting. Even if we can't figure out the answer, there's nothing beyond our physics, nothing beyond our understanding. What does that say right there? Oh yeah, delusional hoaxing. And then they get into the whole distance argument. How many times have you heard this? And it gets very condescending. It's more like, oh, you people don't realize how distant the stars are. Do you realize how distant the stars are? And we all say, yes, actually we do realize that. The problem that I have with their argument is it sounds great on paper. Sure, anything sounds great on paper. The New York Yankees look good on paper this year, but unfortunately you have to play on grass. So the skeptical hypothesis looks good on paper too. The problem is there are reports which indicate something is happening. And when a skeptic says, well, it's impossible for us to get from here to there, I would say, sure, our technology makes it very difficult. I'm not going to survive to the nearest star, but I mean, even 20 years ago when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, so where are we going to be in another 20, 30, 40, 50 years? I mean, right now we're achieving very significant artificial intelligence. We're going to get much more significant soon. Quantum computing is either here or right around the corner. Google's working on it hard, big time. NSA may already have it. They may already have quantum computing, according to a number of analysts. And then you've got nanotech. Organic 3D printing is right around the corner. You combine a lot of these technologies, and is it really hard for us to imagine that an artificially intelligent being or ship could make a trip to the nearest star in another 50 years? I don't think so at all. So I think the skeptical argument really suffers from a lack of imagination. I'm not saying let's have our minds open so far that our brains fall out, as they say, but I think we do need to be a little bit more creative here. Next slide. So one step removed from the skeptical hypothesis is this. Let's call it, this is well known as the psychosocial hypothesis. And it's a good hypothesis in many ways. I mean, essentially what it would suggest and what they would state is that this phenomenon responds to our cultural expectations and to our psychological expectations over the years and decades and centuries. And I think that's true. The images that I have here go right on down. So the top one is, I'm sure many of you recognize this from a 16th century German woodcut describing something very unusual that was seen in the skies over Nuremberg at that time. I don't know if we could ever find out what that was, but it's clearly something triggered the imagination of the witnesses at the time. The image just below that is from the 18th century London. I'm trying to remember the year, 1760 something, I believe. And that's actually included in an academic journal called Philosophical Transactions. And the author of that was an extremely well-written, thoughtful man who was the witness to an object, a silent, rocket-like object flying at a horizontal trajectory over London. Now in the 1760s, that didn't really make any sense. But he described it as something like a rocket. And there were fireworks and rockets and things like that, primitive ones, that existed at that time. One slide below that, one image below that is from the famous, infamous airships of the US in the late 19th century. Incidentally, I learned, maybe I had heard and forgotten, but there were airships in this part of the world in 1909. I'm sure some of you have heard of this. In 1896-97 in the US, across a lot of the western United States, from California over by Texas and as far east as Illinois, by Chicago, the central part of the US, there were quite a few reports, many spurious, not all seemingly spurious, of what people were calling airships. Now, airship technology, there were airships in the world in 1896 and 97. They couldn't go more than a couple of miles without crashing and killing the pilots on board. It wasn't until the Germans invented the Zeppelin in 1904-ish, that you actually had an airship that you could navigate and that could go more than a couple of miles without crashing. So this is a decade ahead. And there is no indication. There has been some suggestion recently that there were some secret American inventors of airships, but this is has not gone beyond a little bit of speculation and a couple of scraps here and there. But there's really been no indication. What were these things? I don't know what these things were. But it was in the mindset of the era. It was, we're talking a decade or two ahead of what people were then doing. And then you move down forward to the flying saucer images of 1940s and 50s. much more mechanical, much more sophisticated. And then, you know, down in our own era, I mean, we see things, we see craft, but we see these plasmas, we see orbs. The phenomenon has evolved, and you could argue, over the years. So why is that? Well, the psychosocial hypothesis would suggest that there's something about our mind. It's not that there's nothing there, but it's that there's something there, but it's beyond us. And our minds react in ways that we're predisposed to understanding. Most of the people that I would consider psychosocial theorists of UFOs, I would consider them generally skeptics, and they are skeptics of any kind of extraterrestrial hypothesis. They don't usually talk about interdimensional and things like that either, but they are at least willing to acknowledge that there's something strange about our world, and maybe we'll understand it one day, maybe we won't. Next slide, please. And then we start getting into some interesting stuff with the interdimensionals. Vallée and John Keel and a number of others back in the 60s, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the lecture. I published a very interesting book a year ago. I have a small publishing company by a fellow named Mike Clellan called The Messengers, and I will come back to that. That's a fascinating study. But the interdimensional idea, we can all kind of understand what this is about. They're beings, they're not really from another planet, they're from another dimension of reality. A spiritual dimension maybe, or I have a hard time understanding what another dimension might be. But that they're here. Jacques Vallée pointed out years and years ago, he said, well, we've got thousands of sightings every year. Are we really talking about extraterrestrials surveilling the Earth? Really? Still? And he had a point. Why would we have to see thousands of UFOs every year? Didn't quite make sense. You know, what are these ETs doing if that's what they are? So, you know, and then he writes back in the 60s a book called Passport to Magonia, and trying to tie this in with ancient fairies and ancient sightings and things that we would consider more spiritual in nature. Is that what we're dealing with? Are these not really beings from another planet, but from some other part of our reality that we don't quite understand? Could you hit the next slide, please? I try to understand it. I came up with my own little version of it. I call it my fish pond theory. Someone later said, that came from Michio Kaku. I said, no, he probably stole it from me. That's my thought. My way of, look, if you see that, I think this image describes it well. So there's a guy in the water and he sees all these fish, and maybe the fish see him too. So I feel, how do I describe this? I'll describe it this way. This is a story I like to tell. It was very important to me. I think it will always be important to me. It was when I was 20 years old and I was feeding my dog. Forgive me if you've heard this. Back then I was a hardcore, almost militant atheist. I'd gone through that whole period. And I thought, you know, well, we believe in God because, well, we're psychologically disposed to it. You know, we have an omnipotent mother and father, and we develop a need on God the Father, God the Mother, whatever. And I was thinking along these lines. Then I was feeding my dog. So I'm opening up a can of dog food, and I'm watching my dog watch me. So my dog knew exactly what I was about to do. And I put the food in the can, in the bowl, and he's eating. And I thought, well, you know, your dog's very intelligent. He knows me. He knew that I was taking dog food out of the can. And he knows a lot of things that I'm not aware of, sights and smells and sounds, because he's a dog. He's good at that. But I thought, but he does not know how the human factories make dog food and put it in cans. Like my dog, because he's a dog. He's a smart little guy, but he can't figure that out because dogs aren't designed for that. He doesn't know that what the moon is if he howls at it. He doesn't know that he's been taken out of his natural environment to live with humans and all these other things. And I thought, well, gee, Richard, you're so smart. So your dog's at this level, you're at this level. What's at this level, or what's at that level, or at this level? It was a good moment for me. First of all, it chilled me out from my militant atheism. I thought, just because I can't explain something in a logical way doesn't mean that it's not the truth. I may have a hard time proving it, but my mind does have its limitations. And our limitations, this is why I have it in a pond. We have a pond, and our pond is space-time. Our minds organize reality spatially and temporally. And any physicist will tell you that space and time are not what our common sense say. Space is not something that just goes. Time is not something like a river that just goes. They're intertwined. We call it the space-time continuum for a reason. A Big Bang theorist, for example, will say to you, when I was a kid, I learned about the Big Bang, and I thought it was some big explosion in space. No, wrong. The Big Bang was the creation of space and time. There was no before the Big Bang. Any physicist will say this, and we go, huh? How does that make sense? It doesn't make sense, but it's what they will tell you. And moreover, there was no space for the universe to fit into prior to the Big Bang. Again, totally counterintuitive, but this is the case. What that tells me is space and time are finite. They have a point of origin. So that's interesting for me. I thought about this a little bit further, and I remember when I started thinking about the remote viewers, this is years ago, I thought, how is it possible for a remote viewer to see not only on the other side of the world, which they can do, but in another point of time, past or future? They've done it both. How is that possible? And I thought, well, is it possible that a part of us can step outside of that finite space-time reality? In old Christian theology, if you read St. Augustine from 1600 years ago, he said, when God created the universe, that's when he created time. And I'm like, really? What? Isaac Newton comes along 1,000 years later and says, no. Time just exists. But now these physicists, in a sense, are kind of agreeing, in a way, with what Augustine said all those years ago. So I thought, what part of it of us that can step outside of our space-time reality and see a different point along the space-time continuum? Well, the ancient people had a word for it. They called it the soul. Maybe that's as good a word as any. I don't pretend that I know this. But what I'm saying here is that we perceive reality in a certain way. If there are beings that are a little further up the chain, my question is, are they able somehow to enter or leave our space-time reality? I think, yeah, they would. And if they can enter it, maybe we're a little more advanced than the fish, so we can perceive them, we can notice things, but we still may struggle to understand what it is they're doing. I mentioned my friend Mike Clellan before, author of The Messengers. He put it better than anyone I've ever known. He said, imagine if dogs were to have conferences about what people do when they pull out of the driveway in the morning. They might have a hard time figuring that one out. That's like us trying to figure out what these other beings are when they enter our reality. Maybe that's the case. All right, next slide, please. So beyond the interdimensional hypothesis, I have a couple of other ways of thinking about this phenomenon. I made this title up. I call it the parallel development hypothesis. I think we can kind of figure this one out. Think of an ancient, what I like to call a breakaway civilization. Think of it in ancient times. So I remember a few years ago, I wanted to read this for years, I finally read a book by Manly P. Hall called The Secret Teachings of the Ages. I'm sure there are people here who know this book. He wrote it about 90 years ago. Manly Hall was a kind of a genius. Canadian, went to move to Los Angeles, and in his 20s, in the 1920s, wrote a book that's this fat. When I read it, I didn't realize how young he was. I thought this had to be written by someone at the end of his life after a lifetime of studying ancient esoterica. No, he was in his 20s. And it's about the esoteric traditions of human civilization from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, Sumer, through what do you call the Eleusinian mystery traditions of the Mediterranean, the ancient Judaic and Christian esoteric, not the ones for the masses, but the tradition for the initiates. And what he pointed out is that there is a long-standing tradition of secrecy among spiritual initiates. And his take on it was that they were really all concerned with immortality of the soul. That might be the case. But whatever the case is, he made it persuasive to me that there has been a long-standing, maybe continuous, secret, classified spiritual tradition going way, way back. And if that's so, I just wonder, and I'm only wondering, I'm speculating here, is it possible that there were ancient breakthroughs that some early group had in terms of knowledge that they didn't want to share with the rest of the barbarians who inhabited the planet? Maybe the secret was too important. Is it possible, and again, this is only a suggestion, that there has been a clandestine group that has had access to knowledge, maybe Tesla technology, way back when, who knows? So this is, and it's a theory that I think we've probably all encountered at one point or another. So that's one other possibility. Next slide, please. And then, oh yes, the time travel hypothesis, let's not forget that. That's a rendition, it's not a photograph, it's a rendition of the Rendlesham Forest case from 1980. And I mention it here because that case, among others, has been associated, at least by one of the witnesses, with time travel. James Penniston, who was an American NCO, non-commissioned officer in the Air Force at the time in 1980, has, for the last 5+ years, maintained adamantly his opinion that what he experienced were time travelers from the future. I don't really have a strong opinion about this. I actually don't think this would not be my go-to position, but I don't pretend that I know. It's a theory. I have a hard time understanding, to be honest with you, how time travel into the past works. I mean, I do recognize that space and time are a fabric. If you can manipulate space, maybe you can manipulate time. I've had a theory about this. So if you think of time as a series of moments, what are those moments? One way to define them would be the sum total of all of the positions of everything that exists in the universe. Because everything's in motion, and so if everything is moving, then there's got to be each permutation of the positions of everything in the universe would constitute a moment. And if that is so, to go back in time would mean what? Do you move everything back into position? It would be hard, because I can't imagine going back in time in Earth. Where would this past exist? I don't know where that past would exist. But again, I only have a very limited brain here, so maybe there's a way that they can do it. I don't understand, personally, how the time travel theory can work. Next slide. Oh yeah, and then the PSYOP, secret tech hypothesis, basically the Nazi UFO theory, the Tesla tech theory, the black budget S4, Area 51, Dugway Proving Ground theory, the Pine Gap theory, wherever they're developing secret tech, the black triangles, that this is another explanation for the UFO phenomenon. I think this is, in fact, a definite partial explanation for the UFO phenomenon. I'll just tell you, I've had a number of interviews and conversations with people who have had intersection with the black budget world. I had an interview a year and a half ago with a retired engineer from Boeing about black triangles. I met him and his wife. I talked with him at great length. He was explicit with me, he was adamant with me, I guess I should say, that Boeing was working on black triangles when he was there in the 1980s and 90s. He retired around 2000, 2002, I think he retired. And he said he didn't pretend to understand all of the technology, but they were, in his adamant opinion, reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology, using some kind of geomagnetic, as he put it, propulsion principles. He indicated to me that they hadn't fully mastered it, by the way, that they had accidents and things went wrong, but they were working on this technology, basically the big black triangles. That was his contention. I think I believe him. I think that without a doubt, we have been working on some very advanced technology. This is why I developed an idea called the breakaway civilization. Essentially, it's like a black budget classified world on steroids, you know, with extraterrestrial technology tossed in there. And the idea being, if you've got Roswell Tech, or even earlier in the US in 1941, Cape Girardeau, and a number of other cases where I think are legit, you would study this technology. Some of the breakthroughs would be good money makers, for sure. Others might be a little bit too important to segue to the rest of the world, whether we're talking advanced propulsion or non-petroleum based energy sources. Yeah, those would be a little bit too important to share, I think. And what that would mean is the classified world would continue working on those, classifying those breakthroughs, not allowing the rest of us to basically holding our future hostage. And I do believe that that has happened. How far they've gone is anyone's guess. Do they go off-world? Well, I think they do. I'll talk more about that in the next lecture. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, so this is actually one of the most interesting theories that I've encountered in the last few years, the simulation hypothesis. It's not strictly speaking a UFO-related thing, but I think it's relevant for this talk. So think of the Matrix, right, where you're in a simulated reality. Has anyone here not seen the Matrix? Thank God, no one's, okay, we've all seen it. I didn't want to ruin it for you. It's only 20 years old. So it's, beyond a simulated reality. In the simulation hypothesis, you yourself are an intelligent algorithm. And I know it sounds a little crazy, but I've been reading up on this, and it doesn't sound quite as crazy as you'd think. There's a fellow named Nick Bostrom who's he's good on this. And I'm not saying he's right. I'm not saying it's possible to prove it. I don't think it's possible to prove it one way or the other. But essentially the argument is that we are in a grand, computer, super hyper artificially intelligent scenario, and we ourselves are artificially intelligent algorithms, programs that believe we are real. I'll leave it at that. It's an interesting theory. I see some skeptical faces. One of his ways of expressing it was as follows. He said, so let's imagine a future in which we have the ability to create totally immersive virtual reality recreations of the world, including of the human past. So you can have a virtual reality simulation of the beginnings of Australia, or of New York City in 1850, or whatever time period you want, he said. We could have a virtually infinite number of recreations in which, when you go into those VR simulations, you're not only in an immersive reality, but the people you encounter in those VR realities are artificially intelligent programs that interact with you as though they're alive and thinking. He said, so if we can imagine this, a virtually infinite number of VR scenarios, what makes us think that we are the only ones who are not the VR scenario? That's one of his arguments. And I thought, somehow I don't like this argument, but I had a very difficult time disproving it. Maybe it's impossible to disprove. Anyway, the simulation hypothesis is interesting. And if you start thinking about synchronicities in our world, bizarre synchronicities, and again, I'm going to come up to that in a little bit, you wonder. And I'm not saying that I believe this, but I just think it's an interesting thought to put out there. Next slide, please. So after all of those really interesting, cool theories, maybe the ETH does seem a little boring. Next slide. But I wouldn't be prepared to toss it out just yet. I believe generally speaking, I guess I've been a supporter of the idea that what we're dealing with in the core of the UFO phenomenon is the presence of an other that is not from this world. I still feel that that's our strongest scenarios, and I'm going to tell you why, but not a 1950s version of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So can you hit the next slide, please? So there's a lot of UFO evidence that supports an ETH. It's not simply officially documented cases, and this is really where what got me into this field 20 plus years ago. Back in the early 90s, you may know this, you may not, I had the idea back then that I was going to teach at some university, teach history, that's my training. I was studying US Cold War strategy, the birth of the CIA, and the Truman's attitude toward the Soviets and so on. And then I became obsessed with UFOs. And when I dove into the field back then, my number one interest was looking at declassified documents to prove whether or not the US government was interested in this subject. And absolutely, saw proof they sure as hell were interested. So there's a lot of officially documented cases that do hint strongly toward an extraterrestrial solution to this. There's also what I call unusual cases, encounters with beings. I'm going to go into all of these in a little more detail. Experience or testimony, and consciousness research, and also, what's that last thing? Oh, high strangeness cases. So you can hit the next slide, please. So in terms of the officially documented cases, there's no question in my mind. So the official documents show, for example, hundreds of military engagements with UFOs. The US documents are best on this, better than any of the other countries. They show during our Freedom of Information bonanza era in the late 70s, when FOI was a new thing in the US, researchers shook that tree, and a lot of documents came out that did describe incredible violations of sensitive airspace by objects that were not supposed to exist, but they did exist, that were not supposed to do things like zigzag or instantly accelerate, but there they go, they're in the documentation, in which through visual observation and radar tracking, the simplest, most logical solution was that these were craft, technological craft, coming from someone somewhere. And in a lot of the US analysis, including the famous one in the CIA from late 1952, the director of scientific intelligence of the CIA wrote to his boss, the director of the CIA, Walter Beadle Smith, and he said, sightings at this time at altitudes and in the vicinity of major US defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. So that's a pretty straightforward statement. And he wasn't really, saying, boss, I think we're being invaded, but pretty close. And the idea is that these were not Soviet. We couldn't really, that didn't make sense to us. And it didn't make sense that they were natural phenomena. But they're objects. There was one that the US Air Force tracked in early 1951 under what was called Project Twinkle. This is a triangulation project in the American Southwest. They use what were called theodolites. So this is measuring instrumentation that can measure the altitude and azimuth and angle and all of this stuff. And so they had 3 of them set up, and they captured one triangulation. They buried this in their report, which said, no, we had no evidence. Wrong. They captured one object at 100,000 feet altitude, really high up there, in 1951, moving it several thousand miles per hour. The report did not specify exactly how fast, but several thousand miles per hour with a diameter of 30 feet. So a really decent-sized object, and they nailed it. What's the explanation for that? Is that an interdimensional phenomenon? Is that a time travel, or is that just a really hell of an amazing advanced technology coming from where? Did we make that? Didn't seem like it if you read the through the Air Force analysis. So there are things that suggest something that's not from here. They don't prove it. What else do I have here? I can't read. Oh, yes. So the idea that these were indicating grave concern and were subject to obvious secrecy, and that secrecy to this day, makes you wonder, are these extraterrestrial? Next slide, please. Yeah, and as I was saying, so the conclusions throughout the 40s and 50s and beyond, didn't look like the Russians were doing this, didn't look like we were doing this, as far as anyone could tell. Were they extraterrestrial? This was a conclusion that analysts came back to again and again. And every time they came to it, they were basically just shoved aside and said, no. They were told that it's not the preferred answer, but it was one that analysts kept coming back to. Next slide, please. And there are some unusual cases. I love these cases. So one was from 1927 in the Himalayas, featuring the explorer and philosopher Nicholas Roerich. He was really like a genius. Roerich and his wife were leading a trek in the Himalayas, the Altai Himalaya region, in the middle of nowhere in 1927. And Roerich wrote in his diary, which he later published, that at one point his party saw above a large, I think he said a black eagle, above that they noticed a shiny object, brightly gleaming in the daytime sky. And they watched it zoom across the sky. They got a good look at it. They had field binoculars. And he wrote about it. There was some skeptical analyses done of that case that I think that itself was debunked, but the skeptical analysis was, brace yourself, weather balloon, 1927. There were weather balloons in 1927. They were small. And there was, in fact, a Swedish exploratory party that got as close as 400 miles, maybe, to where Roerich and his party were at the time, not closer than 400. And the argument was, well, maybe because they released a weather balloon and at some point in their trek, we don't know exactly when, and maybe that's what Roerich's people saw. The problem with that is severalfold. One is we don't really know how close they were. Weather balloons are not going to go 400 miles. Not then, not now. And this was a small weather balloon. It was maybe this big. It was a very, very good analysis done that essentially said you'd have to be within a mile or two to be even able to see it. And if it was at a high altitude, you probably would never see it. This object was way larger. So I thought it was a very good counter to that. That sighting is unknown. I don't know what that thing is, but I'll tell you the next sighting, 1936, I found this one in the Canadian archives. I did some research up there. Back in the 70s and 80s, if you were a Canadian citizen, you saw a UFO, you could report it to the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They would forward it to National Research Council, a bunch of scientists who would put it in a file cabinet and run away and never look at the report because they were terrified of UFO reports. But you can go to the Canadian National Archives today and go through these. Lots of well-meaning Canadian citizens writing in their UFO reports. No one ever investigated them, but you can read them. So one was written by an elderly gentleman in the early 1980s. He said, "I'm not really expecting you to investigate, but I want to record this." And he said, when I was 25 years old in 1936, this guy had the coolest job in the world, in my opinion. He was charged with, he was part of a team to fly over the remote Canadian wilderness in the north and take photographs of the topography and the geology so that they can have accurate maps. 25 years old, not a bad job. So there's infinite number of lakes up there, and he had one of those aircraft that would land on the water. And he said, I was doing a pre-flight check, and he indicated where he was. The place was called Aylmer Lake, Aylmer. I looked at it on Google Earth, I gasped. It is truly in the middle of nowhere. And he said, I was doing a pre-flight check. I happened to look upward against a perfectly blue sky and saw the most perfect configuration of an airship one could imagine. He described it as slightly elongated, facing north-south, total, no markings, completely seamless, gray, no reflection. It was just there. And he said, now watch it go from a north-south, and it rotated to an east-west configuration and instantly accelerated to the east, gone in a matter of seconds at the horizon. Instant acceleration. No, I wasn't there. I can't prove that this happened, but I will say he was a very meticulous writer. He submitted his military records to the government so they could verify him. I did not have access to those records, but apparently he submitted them. And there you go. So you can decide what you think of that. I'm willing to believe him. There are a number of unusual cases like this. There's cases that take place in the middle of oceans, Pacific or Indian or Atlantic Ocean. I just published a book by two authors about the history of Russia's USOs, so Russian interaction with unidentified submersible objects. Many in the Arctic Ocean, again in the middle of nowhere. Objects going into or coming out of that ocean, that frozen ocean. What's going on? Who's there? I don't know, again, that these are extraterrestrial, but they seem very physical and tangible. It seems to me that there's definitely a group or an infrastructure or something that's here, and they're operating around the world in very remote parts of the world. And to me, this hints at maybe these beings are from elsewhere and they have a clandestine infrastructure. They don't have to be from elsewhere, but I certainly leave it open as a possibility. Next slide, please. And then encounters with beings. The bottom right is from Australia, as many of you know, the Peter Corey case. There's a number of people who have had encounters with highly unusual beings. Over to the left on the bottom is the Virginia, Brazil case from 1996. Above that is another 1990s case from Rura, Zimbabwe, from 1994. Those school children saw what they described very explicitly as, well, what we would call gray aliens in a landed craft. The Virginia case similarly described a being with red eyes that was cowering. Those are the witnesses, those young people there. And then Peter Corey, who describes two beings at the foot of his bed that vanished. But of course we have the hair samples that have been analyzed in great detail. Bill Chalker wrote a great book about it. So what are we dealing with? There are these and many other encounters that people have had over the years with beings that clearly do not seem human. So we can go through all kinds of mental gymnastics and say, well, maybe the US military is doing military abductions and they're just leaving screen memories of aliens. That's been a theory that people put out there. I'm not saying that's never the case, but this is too widespread to me to make me think that this is actually a true covert op, which all of them are being seen as aliens. I don't know. And I don't know that all of these cases are legitimate, but I think the Corey case is legitimate. I think the Varginha case is legitimate, and I definitely think the Rura Zimbabwe case is legitimate. I've gotten to know one of those witnesses. They're all adults. They're very, they were kids, but they were old enough. They were 8, 9 years of age. They were old enough to know what they saw. And one of them that I've spoken to, she was maybe, 2 meters away from the being, face to face, the same height. And it communicated with her telepathically. That's a lady named Emily Trim. She's on Facebook, and she was one of these witnesses. So there's something that indicates to me that, if I had to take a guess, we're dealing with non-humans. Where are these non-humans from? Well, maybe they're not from here. Next slide, please. And then we have, research by abduction researchers and people who research into encounters. Maybe we don't want to call them all abductions. Maybe that's not fair. But there are certainly apparent abductions. What we can say from this is that the phenomenon appears to be widespread. It's not simply Australia. It's not simply US. It's not simply Europe. It does seem to be everywhere. We don't have a lot of data worldwide. There's a lot of regions of the world where there's just not a lot of research being done. But to the extent that we get research, it does seem that this phenomenon is worldwide. There are cases of people having multiple abductions. There's indications from some researchers, not just David Jacobs, not just Bud Hopkins, but a lot of researchers, that bloodlines matter, that genetic bloodlines matter. If a mother or particular mother, or if a mother or father have an abduction experience, maybe the likelihood that their children may be having these experiences as well. And I get these all the time from people. And I don't focus solely on abduction research, but that's one of the things that I always will look into. And it does seem to be the case that a mother will have experiences and her children might have experiences. What's going on? And when you look into the research, again and again and again, the motif comes out. People who've seen what we would call gray aliens or insect-type beings or what have you, but that do not look human. And there may be other ways of explaining it, but I think one obvious way to explain it is that, yeah, these are actual beings and they're not from here. Next slide, please. I can barely see these slides, so I'm glad that I wonder if I'm going to move up for the next lecture. Here we go. Better. So what I'm saying there is abduction research would seem to support the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but I wonder, are there other scenarios? Is it possible to have an interdimensional abduction experience? And in fact, this is something that people have talked about, right? This phenomenon is getting crazier and crazier. Can you be abducted in your sleep? Could it just be a dream? And can that be an abduction? Can your soul be taken out of your body while you're sleeping? Is that an abduction? I don't know that this is really the case, but there are some people who feel that that is the case. And I don't like to wallow in self-doubt all the time, but I do think that we're dealing with a very strange phenomenon, and we want to consider these possibilities. Next slide, please. And then there's consciousness research. What do I have there? Oh, yeah. So here's something interesting to talk about. This is anecdotal. I don't know if there's been any real data-based research done on this, but how many of you have encountered someone, or if you yourself will say the following: I started meditating a year ago or 2 years ago, and I meditate every day now, and that's boom, I had some kind of crazy experience. I hear this all the time. Is it always the case that focused mental concentration will always lead to contact? No, it doesn't, because it hasn't happened to me. I do meditate as often as possible. I do yoga. I do Kundalini yoga. Haven't had an experience, although I know it's very good for me and I like doing it. But there are a lot of people who have had meditation and they've had experiences as a result, which they believe that the one triggers the other, or out-of-body experiences and the like. I do personally think that there is a link between our mind, our consciousness, and these other beings. And definitely in a lot of the abduction research, it does seem to be the case that these beings are very telepathic. I spoke to one abductee who was featured, in fact, in one of John Mack's books on abductions. He's a very good guy. He felt strongly, after his own experience, that these beings were intensely telepathic, that operated on kind of like a hive mind. He said furthermore that they had to slow down their thinking in order to for him to relate to them. He said, I almost got the feeling that it was almost painful for them to slow down to the extent that I could actually communicate with them. But there is this intense telepathy. And indeed, anytime you come across any abduction or experience or contact, I mean, we always hear that it's telepathic. I mean, if you read an account of aliens talking, flapping their gums, I think that's when I would be skeptical, because, I mean, that never happens. It's always mind to mind. And so there's a consciousness connection. And could you get the next slide, please? I think I have a little statement there. Yeah. So the question is, are they extraterrestrial? Are they spiritual beings? You know, I don't know that consciousness research and this telepathic connection proves that these are extraterrestrial beings. I don't know that they prove that they're interdimensional spiritual beings. But I think they could be extraterrestrial beings that are very, very telepathic. Next slide.
Richard?
Yes?
Half an hour to break. Just so you know. Half an hour to break time.
Oh, yeah, good. Oh, we're doing great.
Yeah, just so you know, yeah.
I have a bad habit of going way over my time, but I think that we're going to be all right here. I'm trying to keep it moving. And now we're getting to some strangeness. And there's Mike's doc on the top right, Mike Clellan. I published that at a company called Richard Dolan Press 1 year ago. I think that's an amazing book. I think it's one of the best books in this field published in the last decade. I don't have copies here, but you can get it on Amazon or the ebook. I'll tell you about it in a second. And then there's Whitley Strieber's Communion, Linda Moulton Howe's Glimpses of Other Realities, Volumes 1 and 2. Excellent collection. And the late Mac Toney's The Crypto-Terrestrials. Another very fine book. So there's some very weird strangeness. I feel like this is a big part of our field. When I started researching this 20 plus years ago, I was ultra conservative. I still am conservative, believe it or not, but back then I was really conservative. My attitude back then was, I don't even want to know what people think about this. I'm not interested in what I think about this. I simply wanted to know the facts. I really, you know, and I think I was smart at that time not to, because I was a true newbie. And I thought, I don't really think I should have too many theories. But, you know, this field is a strange enough one that it just pulls you into, if you're willing to swim into the deep waters, there's a lot of strangeness out there. Mike's book, I'll just describe. It's a big owl on the cover, and you think, why are there owls on this? So it's called, the subtitle is called Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee. Mike Clellan is my friend. He's a real outdoorsman. He lived in the state of Idaho for many years, out in the wilderness. He's a guy who could live for 2-3 weeks or more out in the woods, no problem. He's good. And he had a lot of outdoor experiences with owls. And he noticed he had a couple of very highly charged emotional experiences and surreal, almost we would call paranormal, and UFO experiences in connection with owl sightings. Not owls as screen memories like you hear about in abductions, but actual owls. And he started wondering about it. He created a blog site and started writing about his owl experiences, and people wrote to him in droves. He has a good blog. And he collected a lot of these stories, and people who had their own really bizarre owl stories connected with their own strangeness, and in ways that were had high levels of what we would call synchronicities, that is, meaningful coincidences. And it's a hard book to write about. I wrote his foreword because he hadn't written a proper introduction, and I had a hard time writing his foreword. But there is a moment in his book, he talks about 3 of his own experiences. One in 3 different UFO and abduction experiences that he believes he had, and he describes them in great detail. One in connection with an owl sighting, one in connection with a coyote sighting, which is also very associated with magic and shamanism in the US. and another in connection with an actual shamanic experience that he had. And Mike is not just an outdoorsman, but he's an expert map maker and map reader. So he happened to know exactly where all of his experiences took place, down to the meter in the United States, and he found them all on Google Earth, and then in a flash realized, he drew a line that connected every one of them, and it is a razor-thin line connecting them over a period of more than 200 miles, 300 kilometers, an exact line along the American West. And that, combined with the very high strangeness and synchronicities that were associated with each one of those sightings, really made him think, who's telling me something here? These are clues that only he could have figured out because of his particular skill set. It was as if there was an intelligence trying to send him a message and communicate with him. And he believes that owls were one of the key ways that this was being communicated with him. I gave him one of the stories for his book, and it occurred to a friend of mine, a woman who became a friend of mine, she's Canadian, who had a UFO sighting in 2003, and I'll very briefly boil this down for you. So she saw a black triangle over the city of Kingston, Ontario. It's across the lake from where I live in Rochester, New York, in January of '03. And the black triangle was a perfect black triangle with sharp edges, sharp corners. It was a very interesting sighting. She rolled down the window of her car. She saw it go right over her head and glide off. I interviewed her about that. We became very good friends. She's like my sister, and I would trust her with my life. But the thing about her is that she, in the 6 to 8 months before that sighting, she started seeing 333 everywhere. She would look at the clock at work, 333. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, 3:33 a.m. She would get change at the store, 3:33. 333 in license plates. It was everywhere around her, so much so that it vexed her, and she brought it up to a coworker one day. Said, wow, I've been seeing this everywhere. That's when she started seeing 111 and 444 and 222 and 555, and then back to 333. Then her triangle sighting of 3 sides, 3 corners, 3 lights on January 24th, 2003. Well, she's also an astrologer, and she's into astronomy. And I don't do this, but astrologers have, an almanac that they use called, they call an ephemeris. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. It's got all the numbers and declinations and ascensions and all the things that you need to do proper astrology. I couldn't tell you how to do it. In that book are lots of numbers and charts. One time for the year 2003 does 333 appear. It is on the date of her sighting. It's the position of the sun. One time. Is that a coincidence? You could decide so if you wish. I don't think so. And it was one of those things that only she could figure out, you know, because that was her skill set. It was as if, and I say as if in quotes, someone, a grand intelligence, a meta-intelligence, as I sometimes call it, was poking her and saying, here's a little clue. Now, I don't know what this means. Does it really mean that there's some grand... Maybe that's why I wonder about the simulation hypothesis. I have a fun time thinking through these theories. I don't pretend that I know the answers. I do try to differentiate between what I absolutely know, what I could argue if I had to be stuck on CNN and argue UFOs. I would know how to limit my case and talk about declassified documents. But I think it's very interesting, and I think it would be a cop-out for me not to think about these more interesting possibilities. I don't know that I'll ever get an answer to it. But these types of studies by these authors, and there's others, they're part of the field too. And the strangeness is part of this subject. So when we think of an extraterrestrial hypothesis, I think we're not very well served by only sticking to the so-called nuts and bolts. There's something more going on. Next slide, please. So I think, you know, you can't prove that UFOs are absolutely extraterrestrial. I will grant that. But is the extraterrestrial hypothesis really outrageous? Well, let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to tell you why I think it's not outrageous. So this is my take on a fresh ETH, acknowledging that this subject is very, very complex, acknowledging all the limitations that we may have in our own ability to formulate space and time and reality and whatnot. And also with the recognition that it may be difficult. This is the maddening aspect to me when I think about UFOs. I haven't really I haven't been totally satisfied, to be honest with you, with any one theory that explains all of this. I was having a conversation with an American colleague of mine, Chris O'Brien. He writes about cattle mutilations. He's very good, and other really weird things out in Colorado and northern New Mexico. And his opinion is that not only is there no one theory that explains UFOs, but he says some of them, he feels, actively contradict each other. It's as if the phenomenon is so intentionally elusive that it makes it difficult. I don't know if I would go that far, but I do think that there's not one solution that completely satisfies me all the time. Next slide, please. So in my view, if we were to have a fresh extraterrestrial hypothesis, one for the 21st century, one for grown-ups and not for the 1950s, it would have to incorporate a few current things. One is our current understanding scientifically of exoplanetary studies, current astronomy theories. Was it George, were you telling me, I think you were, someone was talking to me about Seth Shostak. Okay, yeah. And basically that Shostak was just talking candidly, not long ago, about how we now are at the point where, was it a third?
No, he said, he was on Australian television.
Yeah.
He said 1 in 5
1 in 5
stars that we see in the Milky Way galaxy,
yes,
has a planetary system, and there's a very high likelihood that those would each have an Earth-like planet that could support life. And then he said we didn't know that 12 months ago.
Exactly. So
18 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge thing. So when we think of things like the so-called Drake equation, what's the formula for figuring out how many planets in the universe might support life? We've come a long way since that was first formulated in the early 60s, and now Shostak's saying 1/5 of all stars probably have a planetary system. That's their best estimate, and many, who knows, but many of them might have Earth-like planets.
That'd be very conservative.
Very conservative. So, and I think you told me that he was also asked, what's the likelihood of extraterrestrial life? He said 100%. I think, then he said it. So, yeah, we've come a really long way from even 20 years ago, when you would be hard-pressed to find scientists willing to admit the high likelihood of extraterrestrial life. Now it's like a given. They all admit it. Oh yes, there's tons and tons of life out there. Carl Sagan even said the universe is teeming with life. Their big skeptical position, as I mentioned earlier, is that, well, they're just too far away. But I'm not so sure we want to rule that out yet. Again, we are 1 or 2 generations away from radically reinventing not only our civilization, guys, but our entire species. All right? I have more to say about that in the next lecture. So I think it would be very foolish to just pretend like time is going to stop right here in 2016 and we're not going to have any more better technology and methods in another 20 years. I think that's really stupid to think that's not going to happen. So I think a fresh ETA should incorporate that, as well as I was just basically indicating, new technological developments, including energy, including propulsion, including automation, artificial intelligence, computing, as well as the UFO-related stuff, the testimony of experiencers and witnesses of this phenomenon. Next slide. So I'll just run through this really quickly. So postulation number 1 for me is that they came here. I believe that this is the best hypothesis. They came here from somewhere. Some of those images there are headlines of dealing with basically our current developments in space drive technology. We've moved a long, long way in the last 20, 30, 50 years. They're talking about different types of space engines, ion engines, and so on, that actually will be able to take us to the stars. Let alone statements like the late Ben Rich 20 plus years ago, when he said in 1993, this is the head of Skunk Works back then, we now have the technology to take ET home. We can now go to the stars, and it won't take a lifetime to get there. He said this in 93. Now we have open source mainstream journalists essentially saying the same thing. Next slide. I think we have to say that these beings are unbelievably, emphasis, unbelievably advanced. Okay, what can they do? Well, we're looking at quantum computing now. Let's assume they have got that and more. We're looking at advanced AI any time now. You're going to open up your laptop and it'll talk to you. You'll say, hey, Marvin, what's up? And Marvin will be able to tell you anything you want to know. And, there won't be any room for us to have jobs. That's a whole other story, the robo-apocalypse. But we're getting there. Yeah, the Terminator's not going to kill you. He's just going to take your job away. And we'll have to figure out what to do about that. But advanced AI, well, let's assume they've got it. They're already there and beyond, way beyond, I would assume. Genetic mastery, yeah, we've already got CRISPR technology. We're doing gene editing. This is revolutionary, just the last 5 years. We've got it is scary, because really when we talk about transhumanism, will it be us or just those who can afford it? There's a thought. But anyway, genetic mastery, organic printing, if they can replace our liver in a few years, or our heart, maybe, with advanced AI and advanced computing, maybe we can recreate an entire being. Just a thought. I don't think it's impossible. Maybe organically print a being with some nanotech tossed in there, and who knows how crazy you could get. Pretty crazy. Virtual reality creation, our ability, we're going to have immersive environments. Maybe they can do that too. And beyond and beyond and beyond. Next slide, please. I think they can manipulate space-time. I was saying earlier that I had a hard time understanding time travel. I do. But I have to acknowledge, I mean, if space can be manipulated, and after all, you know, our own math, even in the last 20 years, we have Miguel Alcubierre of the University of Wales, who comes up with mathematical equations that basically give us warp drive, like on Star Trek, and the math apparently is good. I can't test the math, but other people have. The limitation to warp drive isn't the math, it's not the theory, it's that we don't have the ability to generate enough energy. We have a lot of energy, apparently, but I don't rule that out. I don't know, I don't rule any of that out. The physics are there. And if they can manipulate space-time, maybe they can manipulate time too. I don't know how that would work, but I think they've got it. I think they have ways of working around the speed of light limitation, maybe folding space-time and whatnot. Next slide. And I think this is my own little theory, but, well, not just my own, but I think they're artificially created. I think a lot of these are not naturally occurring beings. I can't think of the grays in the way that we perceive them as naturally occurring organisms. First of all, we've never seen them with sex organs. And when you think about it, if you're creating a being, why would you want to give them the ultimate distraction of sex organs? I wouldn't. It would really be kind of an annoyance to have workers worrying about that sort of thing. So you'd want them not to be like that. And also with those huge heads and the spindly little bodies, this doesn't make sense to me in terms of natural evolutionary development. It just doesn't. You know, the brain comes at a huge cost to the body, and it would make more sense to me that they were designed to function for certain specific reasons that way. And I think that's what they are. I think they're artificially, and maybe artificially created using some of Earth's genetic material. After all, if you're going to interact with Earth, you want to be compatible with the microbes and the microorganisms and so forth. I suspect that that is the case. I don't know that all of these beings are artificially created, but it's just my own little theory that some of them probably are. Maybe most of them are. MacTony's, in his book I mentioned earlier, The Cryptoterrestrials, said against the ETH, he said, well, you know, we encounter these beings, these so-called beings, the humanoids or reptoids or insectoids. He said, we have humans, we have reptiles, we have insects here on planet Earth. And he said, you know, maybe it's the case that we're seeing, he was kind of leaning toward a psychosocial hypothesis here. He said, maybe we're just seeing some kind of projection of Earth life. That's possible, but what also if it's possible that these other beings are using, I mean, literally using Earth DNA, Earth organisms, to create beings that are compatible with Earth's ecosystem? Admittedly, maybe it's a stretch on my part, but I don't know that that is so illogical, actually. This is, again, we're in this field where we're just dealing with some really strange realities. Next slide. I do think whatever these beings are, and I take with a grain of salt any of the descriptions of what these beings look like, because I do believe they have unbelievable powers, including that of virtual reality creation and powers of the mind, a natural telepathy, what Dave Jacobs called ability to have neurological control over us. In other words, if they don't want you to move a muscle, you will not move a muscle. We've come across this in the literature so many times. I think we just cannot ignore this. The ability to levitate people, move people through solid objects. The ability to move themselves through solid objects. I was in Sydney once again, heard a number of amazing recent abduction accounts. that certainly appeared that these beings went through locked doors and solid walls and so forth. And, you know, it's not a case where I was there, I can't prove it, but again, these witnesses to me seemed smart and logical and certainly, you know, not crazy. They seem like very normal people. So I think that this is very much along the lines of what they can do. Incredible powers of the mind. Next slide, please. Oh yes, I think that these beings, so not only do they come here from elsewhere, not only do they have incredible abilities, way beyond anything that we can imagine, but they're interested in us, they're interested in our world. We have a very interesting world. We have a lot of genetic, unique forms of life. We've got all this water, we've got all these great minerals. Earth is an amazing place. As far as we can tell, we compare to other planets in our solar system, Earth is unbelievable. We take it for granted. We, human beings, I think they're interested in us as well. So I think these beings, when we see them in remote parts of the world, yeah, they're interested in that, but they're interested in us. Why wouldn't they be? I always laugh a little bit when I hear researchers almost make fun of humanity, like why would these aliens be interested in us? We're like insects to them. I disagree. I think when you look at our trajectory, it's pretty amazing. You know, for thousands of years, human society was basically the story of horses pulling wooden carts. That was us, you know, manual labor. Suddenly, 150 years ago, we really start working science. We develop trains, and we develop automobiles and aircraft and rockets and nuclear weapons. That got their attention, I think. Computers. Artificial intelligence, iPhones, iPads, looking into the future of nanotech and quantum computing, all in 150 years. That's like nothing. Anyone who's got the ability to watch us has got to know that we are about this close to leaping into their world. They have to know. And if that's the case, then they've got to find us interesting. Whether as a danger, whether as a curiosity, but for whatever reason, they have to know. And I think that anyone who's got an ability to observe us, they're observing us and they're watching. Are they going to leap into us, or are they going to flame out and have an infrastructure collapse and who knows what else? So honestly, I think we're the greatest show in this quadrant of the galaxy. I think Earth right now. If you ever watched South Park, remember they did there was one where there's an alien. We're a reality show here on Earth, and the aliens are about to cancel Earth's reality show. So I wonder if we're kind of like an entertaining reality show to them. Facetiously, I think we're a little more interesting than that. Next slide, please. So I think, oh yes, I think they've probably been here a long time. That's my best guess. I have been on a couple of episodes of Ancient Aliens. I don't know why they have me on there, but I could talk a good game, so I guess they put me on camera for that reason. I don't really focus a lot on the ancient UFO hypothesis. A little bit, though. I do find that I don't believe all of the evidence of the so-called ancient aliens hypothesis. I think a lot of it is a rail stretch and provably false. But I do think that there's enough anomalies in our ancient history. I look at the pyramid at Giza. If nothing else, if you really study that creation, I personally do not believe for an instant the explanation that Egyptologists have for that thing at all. Not at all. So there's a hole in our ancient history. That doesn't mean that it's extraterrestrials that fill that hole, but maybe. Have they been here a long time? I think it's entirely conceivable that they've been here a very long time. Very long time. And if that is the case, have they manipulated us? This is, of course, the theories. We've heard this forever. I don't know how we can ever prove or disprove these theories. Maybe we can, though. Maybe through detailed genetic study in ways that we can't currently understand, but might we in another 30, 50 years be able to analyze our own DNA in such a way to see that it was manipulated at some point or another. I don't rule that out. I think that we may be able to understand this a little bit better in the future. Next slide, please. I'm almost done here. I think that they're quietly interested in us. I sort of hinted at this before. I like that guy with the orange hair. I think we can all identify with that guy. That's why I like that picture. Again, I stated this a little earlier. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I think that we're very intrinsically interesting to them, and it's really all on our trajectory. There may be other reasons that we're interesting to them. Hit the next slide. I think this is where I want to go. All right, I'll come back to it. So yeah, I think a fresh ETH is actually a very good explanation for what we are dealing with. But I think we would want to incorporate this with some of these other hypotheses that I suggested earlier. Next slide. So, oh yeah, I guess maybe I won't be done on. I'm going to try to be done on time here. My take on this is that there are different groups that are here, and on this now I'm just basing this on what I feel is the best research that I feel is legitimate. That image on the right, your far right, that was taken from one of Linda Moulton Howe's books. She stated less than a year ago that she had a very, very reliable source, in her opinion, from U.S. Defense that said that's a very accurate drawing. And that's all that he would say to her. So that's what Linda said. There's the grays. There's the blonde supermodel Nordic types that we all wish that they were the aliens. Actually, I don't really think so, because I would have a real inferiority complex if they were all like that. I'm dating one of those, and I already feel inferior to her. So, but actually, that's a type, and we hear this a lot in the research. I mean, I'm just tossing out a question here. Do they make us? Do they manage us? But that last statement I have, their psychology is alien. I want to focus on this for a moment. To me, this is very important. And this comes down to our nature as human beings. We are mammals. Okay, we're born. We have mothers. We nurse when we're infants. And if we don't nurse at the breast, we nurse at the bottle, and we bond with our mothers and our fathers. And if we're lucky, right? And we get unconditional love from our parents. This is a core of what we're about as people. And then we go through our lives looking for that love. That's what we want. We want love relationships and people who get us unconditionally. It's such a key part of who we are. And I actually feel that when we're divorced from that, when we're broken from that, we're broken from ourselves. It's a sign that we need to kind of fix ourselves to the extent that we can. So that's what we are. We're guided by these deep emotional needs. It's a beautiful thing as far as I'm concerned, as who we are as human beings. So these other beings, are they like that? I somehow doubt it. I've never gotten an indication in any of the research that these beings tell jokes, have emotions, are easygoing, have families, are raised as children the way that we are. And I'm not saying that they're bad, I'm not saying that we're better, but I love what we are, and I have a feeling that they would find our psychology very, very interesting. I just feel like they would, and they might seek to understand that aspect of what we are. But, I mean, if we have a hard time among human cultures sometimes understanding each other, we really have to ask ourselves how likely it is that we and they would have a true understanding. This is where I confess that I'm a bit skeptical when I talk with people who will tell me that they have communications with these other beings. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm not saying these other beings aren't sincere, but I wonder, what is the nature of that connection? Are we really understanding them, or are they telling us what they think we want to hear? Or are we simply telling ourselves what we think we want to hear? I don't know, to my satisfaction, that we really have the ability to connect with them the way that we can connect with each other. I'll just leave it at that. Next slide. So what do I have here? Oh yeah, so I'm kind of repeating myself. I think they're genetically and artificially enhanced, yes. I don't think they're all like androids, but I think some of them seem to be like that. There may be human-looking hybrids that are being created. I've got a lot of stories or a few good stories that I've collected in my own research that indicate that there are these very, very interesting human-looking, but they're not like us, but highly telepathic beings. And, I have to assume they have a civilization of some sort. They have an infrastructure. Next slide. I don't know what that infrastructure is. This is one of the real interesting things that I have. I will furthermore say, and I'm going into this much more detail in the next lecture, that elements of our civilization are trying to deal with them. They're in the classified world. They don't really want us to know that they're trying to deal with them, but they are. Some of these UFOs, I would say, are ours, that we make. Some of these UFOs are not ours. Some abductions are probably abductions that, I do believe in the phenomenon known as military abductions. I don't believe in it exclusively, but I think the black budget world does engage in this activity, at least from time to time. And I do say, and I'll expand on this in the next lecture, that dealing with them, whoever they happen to be, these beings, has distorted and damaged our civilization. It hasn't damaged it in every single way. I think, you know, having them as a kind of input to our civilization has triggered certain developments and advances maybe, but I think it has also damaged us politically and sociologically, and I'll get into all of my reasons why in the next lecture. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, so again, you can hear my voice of skepticism in, you know, whether or not we will truly be able to deal with them as equals. To me, I don't really care if we do or don't deal with them as equals. It's really not important to me. For me, anyway, the interest is not even necessarily understanding who they are, what they are, as so much as removing the distortions to our own civilization that have been caused on by this secrecy. That's the thing. I don't get offended easily, but I'm offended by being lied to by my government. And you should be offended by being lied to by your government. There's something important going on. And whether we'll really ever be able to understand it or not is one thing, but I don't like the fact that my government treats me like I'm 5 years old and I can't really know the truth on this, or at least from what they know, that I have to pry it out of them constantly. That is offensive to me. And I think it's a distortion too, because when you have a society based on a lie, constant lie, that is, this is a real phenomenon, but we're not supposed to talk about it publicly, and so you turn on your television and you hear about the football game or the stupid elections that are, you know, based on phony baloney issues. It's a distortion, and it's a distraction from the truth. It's a diversion, a derailing from the truth. That's not healthy. That's not good for us. Next slide. So, I say right. Therefore, rather than figure all of this out, because I don't really know that I'll ever figure it out, maybe you will, I don't know that I will, but my goal is to simply develop the evidence and obtain public recognition of this reality, what some people call disclosure. And again, I'll come back to this. Next slide. Are we moving? Oh, I've got 2 slides left. Okay. Are we moving toward disclosure? Very quickly. Next. And then again. Next, please. There's Hillary Clinton on Jimmy Kimmel. Are we moving toward this? I'm going to hit this more in the next lecture, but I wonder, this is her on earlier in this year, and he's asking her about UFOs. You may be familiar with this. And she says, no, we don't call them UFOs. We call them UAP. Really, Hillary Clinton? Unidentified, unknown aerial phenomenon. And that's a real term. It's been going around since 1980, and it's true. What Hillary was showing the world is that she knows a few things about UFOs. Well, she does. Sure she does. So does her campaign manager, John Podesta. What I think was going on here, because I don't believe that these questions are random. I don't think that you have Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton on your show and you just sort of toss out random questions. No, I don't believe that. I don't think so at all. So there was a reason that he asked these questions that they wanted to ask. Why? Well, in Hillary's case, honestly, I think it might just be so crass that she wants to get the UFO vote. This isn't like the 1990s, after all. UFOs are kind of out there. I'm not a believer that she's going to do disclosure, not for an instant. But I do think maybe she might be in the beginning process of a rebranding of this phenomenon. We think of UFOs, we think of Area 51 and gray aliens and conspiracies. You think of UAP, maybe not so much. Maybe it's a little less value laden. And if there ever is to be a disclosure in the future, I think it would be after a full and thorough rebranding of this phenomenon to something a little more bloodless, a little less interesting, with a little more of an opportunity for them to steer and spin this phenomenon the way they want. I don't know if they'll succeed, but I wonder if that's the plan. Next slide, please. Next slide. Let's just keep going. So I think if there's a rebranding of this, it would be as a way to minimize abductions, if there's ever a disclosure, a way to minimize the vast chasm between us and them, a way to minimize the cover-up, pretending, oh, well, we don't really know what's going on, we don't really have any Roswell technology, that's nonsense. Because the best way to keep a secret is to pretend to share it. So you give up a little sliver. And I think that would be the plan. Next slide. That's it. Okay, so thank you very much. And I'll come back and talk about the global UFO cover-up. Thank you. Wow, what a whirlwind between the lectures. I talked to like so many of you and got to sign books. I have to tell you, I just love being here. I came to Australia a few days ago. I was in Sydney for probably 2 hours, and I thought I could live here. And I've been in Melbourne for the last 2 days. Melbourne, not Melbourne. Melbourne. And this is like, we were chatting about this earlier. This is more like Sydney's like Los Angeles and Melbourne's like Boston. I kind of feel like that, you know? There's like this older culture going on in this city. It's a beautiful city, and I could absolutely be used to Melbourne very, very well. And when I look at the way things are going down in the United States, like, I really think maybe it's Australia. Maybe this is my future. I could think of many worse places to be, including where I'm going to when I fly back, which is home. So I got my 20-year-old son watching the house. That's fine. Hopefully it'll still be there when I get back, aside from some risky business, whatever he's doing. So what the other thing I was going to mention? I can't remember now. Hopefully I'll get some election chat in here before we're done. That's a depressing thought, no matter which way we go. But this is a study on the geopolitics of the UFO cover-up. So just to recap, when I was a little bit younger and had darker hair and a beautiful mullet flowing from the back of my head, I was studying U.S. foreign relations. And it was then that I fell into the UFO subject, and I've always been primarily politically motivated when I look at the UFOs. It's not that the scientific or philosophical implications aren't interesting to me. They're very interesting, but the politics to me, I feel that's what I know best, it's what I'm interested in the most. And so I like to study how this phenomenon interacts with our political culture. And that's what I want to try to do. In other words, what is this cover-up? How does it work? What is the lifeline of this? How long will it go? Will it end? What happens after disclosure? I wrote a book on that topic, and so on. So that's what this is about. And this is a lecture that I've been evolving for more than a year. I first developed it a little while ago, and it keeps evolving. And this is fresh as well. So let's hit to the next slide. Thank you, George. So, oh yes, let's hit the starting point. So what I'm going to do is this next slide is going to have a lot of data. It's going to have more data than any other slide that I show. So next. Oh, I was wrong. This isn't the one. Okay, so here's the starting point. So let's say you're brand new and you're a total skeptic, and you're like, what's all this then? What's this, these UFOs? Is this all a lot of rubbish? Do Aussies say rubbish? Is that just the Brits? You do say rubbish. We don't really say that in the U.S. We say garbage. Crap. This slide indicates why it's not crap, why it's not rubbish. If you really wanted to know what is the big deal, I would recommend go to this on my website, richardolanpress.com. I have one article. I've written a bunch of articles. This one is 12 government documents that take UFOs seriously. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing here with you. But these are historical documents. They were released through the United States Freedom of Information Act over the years, primarily released during the 1970s. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan in the early 80s undercut the Freedom of Information Act. It made it very user-unfriendly. But a lot came out, and these documents, I've got analyses of each of them. You could read it, and it will tell you why this is important. And as I indicated in the last lecture, there's no one released document that proves UFOs are extraterrestrial. You know, if I were to deal with some dumb skeptic who says, where's the proof that they're extraterrestrial? That's not really the way to look at it. What I would say is there's a top dozen, there's a top 50, there's a top 100 UFO documents, confirmed documents, that prove, they do not hint, they do not suggest, they do prove that the UFO subject is serious and that it represents a genuine concern to the militaries around the world, particularly the United States. I think some of the most interesting documents are there. But they prove that this is a big deal. And it is up to us as is engage citizens to find out why. And there's oddities and all of that to the UFO phenomenon. And indeed, the extraterrestrial hypothesis may really be what it's about. So I would say that's a good starting point. Next slide. And this is the longer slide that I was thinking of. So this is my probable scenario. I've got two aspects. This is the human side of the scenario, and then I'm going to kind of rush through the non-human side because I kind of dealt with that in the last lecture. But to the human side of the scenario, this is what I think is basically has been going on. A, I think there have been crash retrievals. You know, can I really go into all the reasons why I think this has been the case? No, there's not enough time. I think the Roswell event was the retrieval of a non-human technology. That's my opinion, based on the testimony that currently exists. I think the evidence is very good. Not necessarily provable or definitive, but it's very good. Haven't gotten a confirmation from the United States government, but I think there have been crash retrievals. What is absolutely provable is what I was just talking about, classified engagements. In other words, secret encounters, classified encounters by military jets, usually with what we would call UFOs. And this has happened many times. Particularly the US side of it I know best, but there's a lot of good Russian, Soviet cases, European cases, a few Australian cases, some of which deal with US military in Australia. I'm thinking of one from 1973 off the top of my head, but there's others around the world. China, Africa, Southern Africa, South Africa actually, and Europe, everywhere. Britain's got a lot of them, where jets are chasing UFOs. And a lot of them. So that I think you can just take to the bank. Something is going on. So just stop right there. So let's say Roswell happened, and these objects are also being seen over in like nuclear installations, which they were. And let's say your name happens to be Harry Truman and you are President of the United States, and your top generals and intelligence people approach you and they say, sir, not only have we acquired exotic technology that doesn't seem to come from our civilization, but they seem to be here doing things and we don't really have control over them. So that's a very big thing for you to deal with as president of the most powerful nation on the planet. So what would you do? Well, if you were you, not Harry Truman, you might think, well, I'm just going to tell the world. And that would be maybe a good thing to do. Harry Truman would be surrounded by advisors who would say, bad idea. First of all, if you tell the world that this is real, you tell the world that you've got their technology, it would be very difficult not to share that. The better way not to share it with the Russians or any other people that you don't want to share it with would be just to deny the whole phenomenon. And also, if you tell the world that this is going on, are you going to tell them that you've got it under control? Because you don't. Are you going to tell them that they're not hostile? Because you don't know that either. What are you really going to tell the world, Mr. President? And it's a very difficult situation, and I can definitely sympathize with what they ended up doing, I'm certain they ended up doing, which is going into total secrecy mode. Because you can't tell the world you've got this Roswell tech. You can't tell the world that these objects are just hanging out over your most sensitive installations with impunity. And you can't tell the world that you know they're not hostile. And you can't really predict the public reaction and the level of panic that very well might occur. And all the other changes that you can't even imagine because of this great unknown. So the most wise thing to do, at least in the near term, would be to gather your top people around you and to say, let's come up with a plan. Let's figure out, what are we dealing with? What do we do with this technology? Can we do anything with it? Can we create any useful developments out of it? How bad will the public panic be? You find out about that. How are we going to control the media? That's your job. And let's manage the academic institutions, by the way, and make sure that they don't get out of control. I mean, if you think that's impossible, think again. In the history of the US, we know this. All right, there's a lot of good research done on control over the media. There was something called Operation Mockingbird, which was outed by the Watergate journalist Carl Bernstein in the 70s. And what was Mockingbird? Well, what we know, at the very least, is that at least 400 mainstream US journalists were on the CIA payroll during the Cold War. I'm sure the number was way more than 400. I wish we could go back to those days because it's far worse now. The CIA, in its very legalistic manner, said, well, we don't any longer have paid relationships with journalists, blah, blah, blah. No, they don't need to. Those guys are jumping over each other to get a relationship with CIA. And it's not just the agency that's involved, it's the Pentagon, which spends billions of dollars every single year managing its social profile, including not just paying off journalists and dealing with them, but at creating what they call sock puppets. That is basically trolls. Under all the news articles that you read online, some of them are literally paid U.S. Defense Department employees whose job is to create persona, to influence public opinion on news stories. Yeah, they do that to you. They do that to me. Based on my tax dollars, I'm helping to fund that. That's kind of insulting. So the whole management of the media is so thorough. And again, I could do an all-day lecture on this. It is a thorough penetration and betrayal by the media of their job, which is to inform us in an unbiased way. But that's the way it is. That's what the mainstream media is. Corporate and military intelligence community domination. They did it back in the 40s, they do it today. And all the other things that they do. The academic world, same thing, no different. Back, hell, when I was a grad student a million years ago in the 80s and 90s, God, my advisor, I am convinced, was probably working some way for the CIA. I know it sounds paranoid, but his father was an OSS officer during the war, probably, I think, killed some people. His father was a great scholar of Greek literature. My advisor, I'm not going to mention his name, but if it comes back, he's going to get ticked, but was served in Vietnam as an intelligence officer and did a stint at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study and also the London School of Economics, all U.S. intelligence hangouts. I'm pretty sure he was. It's typical with the academic world. You get to there's a revolving door. And it's not that the CIA can control every single professor that exists in the US, clearly not. But the way it was is that you have a couple of big shots, and they round up the sheep. So if some associate professor at some community college gets interested in UFOs, some of the big shots at Harvard will smack them down. In the old days, that was Donald Menzel, who I showed in the last lecture. Leading skeptical hypothesis proponent, was also on the secretly with the NSA, high-level cryptographer. No one knew this, not even his wife. Researcher Stanton Friedman found it out after Menzel died. So there's all of these connections. They do exist. They are real. This is how you keep the people in line. And it doesn't work 100% every time, but it can work pretty well. And I think this is what happened in the 40s. I think this is still exactly what is happening today. World of science can be controlled very easily. If you're a scientist, you know it's all about funding. Where do you get your funding from? Well, you get your funding from the government. In the US, the government's one of the key sources. Industry is the other one. And you go where the money is. And if the UFO subject is classified, then the funding will only be classified. It's not going to be out in the open. So that's how it is. So it's really not that hard. Continuing further with this scenario, all right. Black agencies and budgets. So basically the black budget is classified spending that members of Congress, in this case, don't know where the money's going. There might be a little line that indicates a vague, meaningless title of a program, and they just approve it. No one really knows how big the black budget is. Estimates $30 to $50 billion a year. That's a lot of money. I think it's actually much more than that, because I think the real black budget includes not simply federal classified tax dollars, but things like, securities fraud, narco trafficking proceeds, financial shenanigans that have gone on forever. In terms of drug trafficking, no one knows how big that industry is, but it's certainly one of the biggest in the world. And just because it's illegal doesn't mean that no one wants that money. That's a lot of money. Whether your name is the CIA or the FSB, I suppose, or the Pakistani ISI or the Mossad, whoever you are, you want that money. That's a lot. If you want to rig elections, raise secret armies, do all the other things that intelligence agencies do, blow up buildings and blame it on terrorists, it all requires a lot of money. And drug trafficking is one way that happens. I don't know that this money goes into the UFO program, but I suspect it does. I guess I'll just leave it at that for the moment. So I'm talking about illegal criminal financing, runaway privatized secrecy. So There haven't been many studies of what we call the black budget, but there have been a few. And they've all indicated that what we're dealing with is not a system dominated by the Pentagon per se. It's dominated by the private contractors. So Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, General Electric. That's where the money is. And that's where the dominant power often seems to be. And with these so-called special access programs, or SAPs, SAPs, these are the primordial black budget programs. We don't really have a handle on this in our public life. We don't know how many there are. We don't really know who's running them. A number of years ago, I read a story about the US Navy. They don't even have control over theirs. Forget Congress. The military agencies themselves are often unable to control all of these little squirreled away, privatized, labyrinthine organizations that exist pretty much off the grid within the military and intelligence community. Within the US anyway, this system has gotten so big, it's so out of control. I really don't know if anyone's ever going to get a hold over this. It's enormous, and involves, it's semi-private, semi-public. It's a little bit of both. One of the things that they're doing, and this now I think we can say we have proof of this, is that they're weaponizing this technology. And I say proof. There's something known as the Condign Report. This is out of the UK in the late 90s. And my friend and colleague John Burroughs did the work, and he uncovered this. A lot of us let it slide by, including myself, because it's a big fat 400-page dry as dust report that was apparently declassified accidentally by the UK. But there's gold in there. And one of the things, because John has, because he was at Rendlesham in 1980 and suffered to this day heart issues as a result of the event. Something happened to him when he was there. And anyway, in the Condign Report, so he went through it carefully, and he saw that there were very clear, open references within this classified paper to UAP, unexplained aerial phenomena, and the effects of UAP on human physiology, and it's not a good effect, and also references to weaponizing that technology. And of course it makes perfect sense. I mean, these are military people. This is how they think. If you get exotic technology, or if you have access to studying it, or if you have access to having it, you're gonna create weapons out of it. This is probably in a global competition with other black budget agencies, maybe Russian or maybe Chinese now. And then, of course, you're going to hide your breakthroughs. This is where I come over the breakaway civilization. So some breakthroughs might be really great money makers, high tensile fibers, or maybe lasers, or maybe fiber optics. My friend Dr. Bob Wood believes, and he made I think a pretty good case for the fact even the transistor itself from 1947 might derive not from Roswell, which was from 47, but from Cape Girardeau, which was 1941. And his case isn't a bad one. It's not a bad one. In any case, you might make some breakthroughs that are great money makers. Other breakthroughs might be a little bit too important to hide, whether they're energy breakthroughs, propulsion breakthroughs. I mean, you can kind of see why. If they have a propulsion breakthrough, like anti-gravity, electrogravitics, something along these lines, which many people suspect, that'd be pretty nice. Wouldn't it be nice to have your own little flying saucer? I flew from Vancouver to Sydney. It took 16 hours. I'd like to do a little bit faster than that if I could. And if you have the ability, that's a lot of power. That's a lot of freedom. If there's a non-petroleum based energy source, maybe some version of zero-point energy, maybe. I did a free energy or a breakthrough energy conference in Boulder, Colorado a few years ago. I was there, one UFO researcher. I met a lot of very fascinating energy researchers, and what became very clear to me, I don't know that all of their ideas are valid, but I think some of them probably are. What I learned is that there's a lot of brilliant people in this world right now who are thinking about these energy breakthroughs. I have to think those are real. Now, right now, I think that some of them are probably classified. And if we had an energy breakthrough, if you could have a little device that could allow you to go off the grid, and it could say, up yours to your utility company, that's more freedom and that's more power. So breakthroughs like that, I think, are dangerous from the point of view of the power structure. They're dangerous from the point of view of control. And if we have and I'm going to get a little more into this in a moment, but basically what we're dealing with is a theft of the planet by this many people over all of the water, all the minerals, all the genetically modified foods they want to shove down your throat for the rest of your life. They want to own every single thing in the world, and they're going for it, by the way, and that means control, but ways for us to break the control are not good from their point of view. And I think energy breakthroughs are one, and those would be hidden. But that wouldn't mean that they wouldn't continue studying it on their own. No, they would continue. And maybe those breakthroughs might involve maybe their own version of flying saucers, their own ability to go off-world. Is this the case? I believe it is the case. Is there a secret space program? I believe there is a secret space program. I do not believe, I'll just take this moment to say, most of the current batch of whistleblowers or self-described whistleblowers who have talked about going to Mars. I'm not on board. I'm not on board their Mars spaceship or jump room. I'm not saying I know that they're not telling the truth, but I don't believe that they're telling the truth. I do believe other whistleblowers, primarily those who are a little more cautious and in the past, who do not talk about reverse time engineering and the like. I just don't buy it. But I do believe the whistleblowers like Donna Hare from the early 1970s, who worked for Philco Ford, a subcontractor for NASA, when she talked about how NASA airbrushed photographs regularly about the moon and airbrushing out UFOs. I do believe whistleblowers like Carl Wolf, who in the 1960s was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, talking as well about photographs that he saw dealing with structures on the far side of the moon. And I do believe that there are a large number of anomalies in space that signify an infrastructure that is not supposed to exist, but it does, and that there's something going on. So I think that, and there may be something with Mars as well. I'm not denying this. I had a long conversation, well, long enough conversation with a very brilliant scientist who said to me early on in my research, he said, don't discount the Mars anomalies. There are those of us who are looking at it very carefully. And he had very good connections, excellent connections to the classified world. So my attitude about a secret space program is that it's extremely probable, and a lot of things point to it. The last thing I would say on it is if I were in charge of security over a secret space program and I didn't want you guys to know about it, I might just, knowing it's 2016 and we can all talk to each other and do research, I might just litter the field with a lot of nonsense and put some people out there to say certain things that are not credible and make sure they get in front of people who will put them on video and plaster them to the rest of the world. Because there are definitely people who are absolutely willing to interview anyone, literally anyone with a story. And we do know the intelligence community's had a long history of disinfo on UFOs. So I would just say, don't necessarily believe every single thing that comes along your Facebook feed. But having said that, I believe there's a secret space program, and I absolutely believe that these military-minded people are desperately trying to catch up to them. I say them, whoever they are, these others, as other beings. Again, they think in military terms. And they're desperately attempting to catch up to these other beings, but they're also, again, in competition with any other groups that may be working on this covertly. I had a person who emailed me a couple of years ago. I don't know who this guy was, but he talked a good game, I'll say that. He was very intelligent. And he wrote and said, Mr. Dolan, I read your book After Disclosure. Pretty good book, he said, but you missed something important. He said, you really did not appreciate how panicky and frightened we all are if this were to come out. He said, you're not going to get any, no one will get any cooperation from the black world on this subject unless we are certain that we're not going to be followed around by the torches and pitchforks crowd. He didn't say that, but that's my, he said, unless we're certain that we will not be prosecuted for criminal, for secrecy about this, because there'll be a lot of angry people. And he said, unless we are absolutely sure that we will not be prosecuted, we're just not going to cooperate. And actually, I think I did mention this in After Disclosure, maybe not as much or as strongly as he would have liked. I do think it's a huge issue, the CYA, cover your ass rule, and this and there. I think they're afraid of what would happen. I think a bigger fear, or at least among those people at the very top might just be the implications, the revolutionary implications to our society if all of this scenario were to come out. And this was the theme of After Disclosure, which I do believe is a very revolutionary development. You know, if President Obama were to go on TV tomorrow, as my friend Stephen Bassett believes that President Obama is going to do disclosure before his term is out. I'm like, Stephen, whatever you are smoking, give me some. I want this optimism. I don't believe it. But if he were to say such a thing, can you imagine? How would he do this? It's come to my attention that some of what we call the UFO phenomenon is real. Well, I'm going on a long vacation. See you all later. I mean, there's a lot of follow-up questions. Very unfun follow-up questions like, really, so you've been lying, the government's been lying for the last 70 years? How have you been lying to us? How's the political institutions of our country and the world not been apprised of this? Where's the media been? Where's the academic community? Have you been manipulating our media? Well, yeah, obviously. So a lot of uncomfortable questions. What about the black budget world? Have you been reverse engineering alien technology, underground bases? I mean, it will never end. And you know, there are people with what we might call a dog-like obedience to authority, and they won't ask any questions. But not all of us are like that. Probably none of us in this room are like that. So there'll be a lot of people with questions. So this is, and it's not simply the political blowback, it's the energy paradigm transformation. I think is fundamental. You know, if you admit that this is real, it's going to be all of 5 minutes before people also realize, oh wow, those flying saucers are probably using something other than petrol to go from here to here, maybe something a little bit better. And whatever that better is, it implies a post-petroleum paradigm to our world, which is the most fundamental transformation that I can imagine to human civilization, getting us off of petroleum. Okay, next slide, please. That was a long slide. I don't think any of the others will be this slide. And actually, we're going to skip past this. So the probable scenario, I was talking about these beings, what's going on. Let's just skip past this slide. Skip past. I think they came here, they're very advanced, they can manipulate space-time, they're artificially created. I talked about all of this. Let's go on. And let's just go on off of this. I talked about all of this before. So let's stay on this for a minute. So we've got a secret human infrastructure. We have a covert, let's say, alien presence. We'll just use that for the sake of argument. And I just came up with this little graphic a couple of weeks ago. I like this so far. So this is how I envision our layers of reality. In the center is where we are, or at least where we start out. Mass reality. It's the brightest circle. And it's where all the attention is focused. So like, you know, Kim Kardashian inhabits there when you turn on the TV. There's Kim's ass, hello. There's your football game and dancing with the whatever. The mass dum-dum reality that we're bombarded with every single day. My God, what has happened to human civilization? And this is what we're bombarded with all the time. And then the idiocy of, like in the US, of CNN reality, which is the dumbest, most incomprehensible, confusing form of reality for news that I can imagine. Maybe you probably have something as bad here for all I know. So that's mass reality. But one step beyond that, one leap beyond that I call academic reality. And like, you know, first time you go to university, you're like, oh, wow, Noam Chomsky, or, oh yes, you know, left critique of contemporary culture, whatever it is. And you think, oh yes, I can see beyond the stupid television reality. And you think, this is how things are, you know? Donald Trump's an asshole, or whatever. That's like academic reality. So okay, good. That's a little bit better than the dumb Kardashian reality. But it's really not the true reality. And beyond that, you get into what I call classified reality. The classified world is almost always beyond the academic world. When I was working on a history PhD, which I didn't finish, okay, I did two partials. I did two partial dissertations. I wrote 250 pages total of dissertation material. I didn't finish my diss, so there you go. But in the academic world, when I was studying, I studied the CIA as an academic student. It's very, very hard to get, like, really, like, the true, because the nature of the intelligence world is that you're not going to know about it. If they're doing their job, it's secret. And academicians, like, I think they forget Like they kind of know, but then they forget. They think, well, it's classified, and historians in particular, we like to work with documents. We like to be very factually based. That's fair, that's good, but the liability is that you tend to forget. If it's not available to you, you just kind of pretend it's not there, but it is there. There's an enormous, in the US, there's a book called Blank Check by, what the hell's his name? It'll come, anyone know Blank Check? All right, it'll come to me. A UK writer too. Anyway, he made the case based on his own, admittedly, maybe somewhat limited study, but he believes that more than 50% of all US government documents are in one form or another. Oh, Trevor Paglen wrote it. He said more than 50% of US government documents in one form or another are classified. And so that means, if you look at it, if I'm trying to look at the history of my government, you could really argue that half of its activity or more is secret. So that's a little bit beyond the little academic reality, isn't it? So it's the classified reality. And you notice each layer gets a little darker, a little harder to see. And then beyond that is what I call the breakaway reality. Because the classified world, that's a big world. But the world that deals with this subject that we're here to talk about, that's a very, very limited part of the classified world. Very limited. And that's way beyond what you get in the classified world. And then you've got, beyond that, it's the reality of these other beings, which I think is actually quite far beyond even the breakaway civilization. So there's all of these levels of reality that we're going through. Okay, let's keep going. Next slide. Wasn't that a fun little transition? I didn't put any graphics in here. I just threw this slide together just the other day. So, and it sort of belongs here and it sort of doesn't, but let's just talk about it. So what's driving us into the future? Well, we're moving into a very crazy future, I think we can all gather. So in terms of hardware, there's this thing called Moore's Law. Many of you know about it. Charles Moore in the 1960s talked about how every 18 to 24 months, the number of transistors seem to be doubling on all the integrated circuits. That's been modified. That's held true. And Moore's Law has been expanded really to include just general computing power. And it really does seem to be doubling. Now there's talk that maybe Moore's Law is hitting its limit. Well, maybe, but it's still going after almost about 50 years. We're in a massively exploding increase of computing power. We all have seen this in our own lives with our personal computers. Beyond that, advances in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, nanotech, robotics, 3D printing and scanning, DNA mapping, gene editing. I talked about CRISPR a little bit before, and brain mapping. Next slide. I got one more of these. Implants for greater abilities, so like think super soldiers. That's happening now. Genetic modifications for intelligence, strength, immunity. That is, again, if you can afford it. You read these futurists. They're really frightening people to me. I don't know about you. They scare the hell out of me. I mean, I've read many of Ray Kurzweil's books, and he's brilliant, and I love reading him, but these people, I don't know what kind, you know, they're smoking something really fun too. Like they just believe, oh, it's going to be great. We're going to live forever. We're going to be like the gods. No negative repercussions. Really? I think there's a lot of negative repercussions. I can think of many. It just doesn't seem quite right to me. Maybe my imagination's stifled here, but I also don't believe, not for an instant, that these breakthroughs are going to be for all of us. I just somehow don't believe it. I somehow have this nagging fear that there's going to be a few people who will be able to leverage this awesome technology for their descendants, but maybe not for yours or mine. I don't know about you, but my bank account's not quite ready to afford some of these breakthroughs. And I could easily see a class-based transhumanism. I mean, a real live frightening version of what Hitler and those guys were trying to come up with, that is a true race-based, almost species, you know, their kids be smarter and stronger and have better immunity, and maybe like the gods. Are they going to seem like that? It's already happening in a sense. I mean, you've got a complete dumbed down culture, and you've got a very, very, like the super rich live like, they do live like gods. But maybe they'll be like gods in the future biologically. That's my fear. What else? Oh, population profiling, including predictive modeling, like, you know, Minority Report. That's happening now. They're actually moving toward this. Oh yeah, based on your web searches and your merchandising and who knows. You know, one of the galling things, you open Google Gmail and you know, you get the ads that are custom designed for your emails, right? You've all probably seen this. What's interesting is that you have to assume someone has got your profile. You don't have your profile. Wouldn't that be nice? I'd like my profile. So there's someone somewhere who probably knows each of us better than we may know ourselves in certain key ways. That's a bit galling. But I think that's only going to increase. And not simply with your web-based behavior, probably with a lot of things that we can't even think about. Facial recognition, that's happening now. Voice recognition, very advanced. Comprehensive surveillance, whether through insect drones or let your imagination wander. I mean, total surveillance of society. This is happening. We're probably a generation away or less from a comprehensive blanket coverage of all of us. Oh yeah, mind-reading technologies. I read this just maybe a month ago. So with electrodes hooked up to your brain, if you're thinking words, this apparently, I didn't know this, produces certain brain waves. Specific brain waves that can be decoded with the proper algorithm. And they're at the point, I know, it's creepy, 90% accuracy. Now that's if you're thinking the words, and they've got wires hooked up to you, so it's still a little clunky, but it's a little scary. And you know, what's crazy is that the spin on these articles, this just drives me nuts. It's like, wow, so wonderful, we could help people who are deaf and dumb and blind and can't really, you know, think of things, and they can just think of the words now. They can't say, I don't think that's how they spun it, but basically, like if you're severely disabled, wow, how wonderful. Well, I could see a lot of other really creepy applications to this, and they may not in the future all involve wires, right? I don't know how far they're going to get with this. Anyway, we're moving into this. It's all happening. And what's the last thing? Oh yeah, ultra-fast, ultra-intelligent machines, robots, virtual entities, that is on your computer. You know, the super intelligent IQ of 500 helper, a little bit better than Siri. That's all coming down the road. Okay, so next slide. So with that in mind, just like keep that parked in your mind. This is the future we're moving toward. And there's a lot of other socioeconomic things we're moving toward at the same time I'll talk about. So let's talk about disclosure for a moment. This is a subject that is not a new subject. The word is relatively new, last 15 years, but the concept is really not new. It goes back to the 50s. In the US in particular, and this is something I really did study a lot, there have been movements throughout, civilian movements, to end UFO secrecy. And there was a group in the US called NICAP, led by Donald E. Kehoe, retired US Marine, who was friends with the former CIA director, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, and they were pretty well connected in Washington, D.C., and their belief in the 50s was that, you know, the U.S. had a functioning democratic system. It was basically the belief back then. And that in that system, you would work through Congress. That's a logical, you know, logical policy, a logical attitude. Work through Congress, there are representatives, and let's have congressional leaders talk about ending the secrecy on these flying saucers. And NICAP tried actually many times to do this, and frequently at the 11th hour the rug was pulled out from underneath them, and it didn't happen. Well, we kind of know why, because even in the 50s, America was really an oligarchy and an authoritarian system. There's been a lot of good studies on this. A sociologist named C. Wright Mills wrote a book called The Power Elite in the 50s. He was not in the mainstream at the time, but he was absolutely right. And Mills said, look, you know, Americans like to say they're this democratic society. They're really based on a power structure. Well, today we kind of take that as a given. And there's been many, many studies subsequently that have proven, I mean, absolutely proven, that in US politics, I'm sure here too, I'm sure everywhere, that what we have are oligarchs, and that the laws that are passed are designed specifically for those groups that have the money and the power to make the laws happen. To the extent that poor people get anything in the legal system, it's only because those interests coincide with the wealthy on certain occasions. That's in the US, and that was done, I think, by Harvard or Yale University recently. maybe Princeton. It was one of those three. So if you have an authoritarian system, one that's moving toward, if not already, essentially virtual fascism, neo-fascism, fascism in all but name. Sure, not 1935 Hitler fascism. It's never going to look like 1930s. We're not in the 1930s. We're in the 21st century. Fascism's not going to be called fascism. They're not going to be that stupid about it. They'll call it freedom. And they'll put Monday Night Football on TV for you to entertain you. And they'll show you the Kardashians and all of that nonsense. But it is fascism. When a government... I mean, and I'll just test my little Donald Trump thing here. So you have all the Americans saying, oh my God, Donald Trump's the next Hitler. Well, this is my take on it. When a government can read every email you've ever written, GPS you 24/7, that's called fascism. All right, the barn door opened 15 years ago. It was called the USA Patriot Act after 9/11. It's already happened. Americans have been living in that nightmare for a long time now. So if they're worried about fascism, they really need to look at some other things that have been going on. And in that world, since that's not a transparent government, it's an opaque government that knows more about me than I know about it. In that government, how do we achieve disclosure? Do I just work through Congress? 3 years ago, I was part of what was called the Citizens Hearing on Disclosure. I was very glad to do it. I'm very proud that I was part of it. And we were a group of people who spoke to retired members of U.S. Congress. And it's on YouTube, and you can see a lot of it. And I feel it was valuable because I like that it's left a legacy, a cultural legacy that I'm hoping people now and in the future will refer back to. But is that really the way that we're going to get it, by going through Congress? Well, I'll tell you right now, those members of Congress didn't believe it. They all knew that system's broken. And I agree with them. That system is broken. I just don't see it happening. So if we don't have a true representative system, then what do we have and how do we achieve it? Well, I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So yeah, meanwhile, let's go international now. I like that little graphic. So how does the secrecy work? I started out in this game looking at the US side of it. That made sense. I mean, I am an American, and the U.S. is really the big player with this. It sure is, but it's not the only country in the world. There are 200 or so sovereign nations, at least in theory. So how does it work? I've gotten asked this question many times. I've thought about it. I think I'm going to offer my answer to you right now. Next slide, please. So one thing is, let's forget the nations. Let's forget the countries, and let's look at a global power structure. So as I see it, we have a transnational financial and political elite. You know, they meet at like the so-called infamous Bilderberg meetings. Sure do. They also, if you want to go to an open Bilderberg meeting, it's called the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado. You can go there. It's really the same thing. They're just a little more politically correct. But all the same people who attend the Bilderberg meetings, many of them will speak at the Aspen Institute, and they will tell you what their plan is for the future. And their plan, by the way, is to create well, they wouldn't say this, but it's a world in which they are the lords and we are the serfs working for them, and your children and your grandchildren, in a transnational global system that is micromanaged by them, because they are quite convinced that they know how to do this. They're quite convinced that they're smart enough, and they can manage you and they can manage me. So they've got it. Through the United States, which has, after all, the most ass-kicking military in the world. So you got to control the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence community, and the U.S. And the black budget agencies within the U.S., NSA, NRO, that's the National Reconnaissance Office, both of which existed in total secrecy for a long time. The U.S. has a long tradition of powerful intelligence agencies that don't officially exist. I have a feeling that still is continuing. So through those agencies, through their relationships, partnerships with other nations, including Australia, and the so-called Five Eyes, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. That's US, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, outed by a New Zealand journalist in the 90s, known as Project Echelon. I have a feeling it goes by a different name now. This is a global electronic intercept operation in which the NSA and the NSA equivalents of these nations share their data. Get around a lot of legal issues too, like spying on your own population. You know, so GCHQ might spy on the U.S. and give the information over to NSA. That's how it looks like. And Edward Snowden's revelations certainly dovetail with a lot of that. And so what happens is that the U.S. is, let's say, first among equals. I mean, there's way more money in the U.S. black budget infrastructure than here in Australia or in Britain even, or in Canada, or anywhere else for that matter. So the U.S. is the dog that gets to pee on everyone's tree. Sorry, but that's, I think, how it is, and dominates its relationship, but in partnerships. And nations like Australia are very high up, I think, in the level of those partnerships compared with a lot of other countries. So that's how that's the beginning of the secrecy. Next slide, please. But then, you know, that doesn't necessarily answer the question, why would nations remain silent? So first thing I have to say is most nations in this world are dominated by the United States. All right. If you look at something like global military spending, right? So the latest numbers that I have, I think, are from 2014. And 2014 numbers, the U.S. spends about 40% of global military spending. It's a lot. Second, by the way, is China, way down at 8% in 2014. Third is Russia at 3%. And then after China and Russia, they are the two nations that are near the top of the list that are not U.S., like closely integrated in the U.S. system. So all the others, Britain, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Poland, Australia, they're all up there. And when you look at the U.S. and its all of its allies, that's about 85%. And Russia and China and a few others are about 15%. The U.S. dominates, the U.S. and its allies dominate this world. And think about, again, with some of the Snowden revelations, think of Brazil, which, by the way, just had a soft coup, we can call it that, against President Dilma Rousseff, who was ousted in a what was absolutely certainly a U.S.-led and Brazilian billionaire-led propaganda media campaign against her, so that they could bring the IMF and the Western banks back into control over that country. And they're succeeding, essentially making up fake claims against her that she's corrupt. There's no evidence that she's corrupt. There's corruption in Brazil, we all know that, but Dilma seemed to be pretty clean. They threw her out, she's out of power now. But with Snowden's revelations, what we learned is that the NSA monitored her cell phones, as with Angela Merkel. We heard about that too. So in case of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff's phones were monitored, her emails, all of her ministers. So let's say your name is Dilma Rousseff and you want to disclose the reality of UFOs. You're thinking, the hell with the US. Let's just talk about this. Well, you'd have to be really careful, because NSA would monitor every single thing that you say. You would have no privacy, nor would your ministers. How would you do it? Go out into the field with a little pencil and paper and whisper into each other's ear? I mean, you'd have a really tough time planning out a disclosure. So that's a big problem right there. The NSA hears all and sees all. I think most people in this world do not, especially Americans, they do not have a true appreciation of how widespread this is. Another reason that nations don't give up the secret is real simple: bribery. It's one of the great unspoken realities of the political world. It's endemic. People are bought off all the time. It's just a form of doing business. And the other side of it is blackmail and surveillance. I mentioned surveillance, I guess, a moment ago, but blackmail. USA has a really great whistleblower named William Binney, who I consider pretty much a hero, high-level NSA, and he's just kind of gone rogue. He's telling the truth. And one of the things that Binney has said is that if you get to a certain level in the political system, guess what? You're going to have a sit-down with one of the three-letter agencies, NSA, FBI, CIA, whatever, and they will let you know every little thing you've ever done that you should not have done. Every website you've gone to, uh-oh, naughty. Every little encounter you may have had, they've got you, and they let you know, and they control you, and they will destroy you if you go off-road from what they want you to do. This is what Binney said. And actually, I heard this as well from my very good friend, Catherine Austin Fitts, who is also a member of the cabinet of George Bush Sr., And she's also, like Benny, gone rogue, and she's a brilliant lady. I recommend you check her out. Financial whiz as well. So I think this is a reality. Bribery and blackmail. That's enough, the carrot and stick, to keep most people silent. Beyond that, I think most... Oh, and then, of course, if you really get out of control, they'll just regime change you, like they just did in Brazil, and they do everywhere. They did it in Ukraine in 2014. CIA engineered coup there. Beyond that, I think most nations actually don't have a lot of data on this. Again, back to military spending. The U.S. is 40%. If you look at the top 10 nations, I think the number is the top 10 nations of the world, of the 200 nations, account for, I think, something like 80% of global military spending. So it's really, and everyone below that, they don't have enough money to spend on an expansive intelligence community. Not really. Not like what America has or Russia has. So most nations are really not players, insofar as the U.S. might let them be players as part of the system. But I think most nations do not have enough specific knowledge. So there's really only a few countries, in my opinion, that would have an ability to trump the U.S., as it were, and jump in front of the U.S. to disclose. It's really not as many as we think. Yeah, there's 200 nations out there, but they're not all equal in knowledge and power. And I think the last reason most nations don't jump out in front of the U.S. is fear. Not simply fear of what the U.S. would do to them if they get out of line, but I think just fear in general of this great unknown. I think the U.S. secret keepers have a fear. I think the Russians have a fear. I'm going to get to them in a minute. And I think there's a general fear about this subject. Next slide, please. So what about Russia and what about China? I feel like I know more about the Russian situation than the Chinese, but I'm going to try to deal with both. So next slide. Because these countries, they're not under U.S. domination. The U.S. is at secret war with both of them right now, absolutely. And U.S. power structure wants nothing more than to switch out Putin and maybe even Xi Jinping as well from China. Definitely Putin, because he's too independent. When Boris Yeltsin ran Russia, aside from consuming massive amounts of vodka, he gave away his whole country to Western banks and financial interests. I mean, it was a big fire sale for a decade. Of course the U.S. wanted him in. And incidentally, what's interesting is how, in the current election campaign, Hillary Clinton's talking about how Putin is working through Trump to undermine the U.S. elections based on this much evidence, zero evidence. But in reality, what we do know is that back in 1996, the U.S. was very proud of the fact that it did influence the Russian elections to get Yeltsin back into power. I guess it's okay when the U.S. does it, though. Because the U.S. are the good guys, remember? Anyway, as far as with Russia, so Russia has a long history of its own encounters with the UFOs. We know this, there's no question about it. Particularly during the breakup of the Soviet Union, a lot came out, a lot of KGB files came out, and a lot of statements came out. So, they have just as many dramatic, incredible military encounters with UFOs as the Americans can talk about. They have crash retrievals. Absolutely several that look very, very persuasive. And all those four individuals at the bottom all confirm statements. On the far left is Dmitry Medvedev, who's the #2 political figure in Russia to this day, next to Putin. Pavel Popovich, the famous cosmonaut, really a Soviet hero, has talked very openly about UFO reality. And those two gentlemen on the right were Soviet officials in the late 80s, early 90s, Igor Maltsev and Ivan Tretyak. Both of them, I read many of their statements circa 1990. They were very candid. It was a particular moment in Russian Soviet history. Gorbachev was in power. Everything was in flux. I'm sure many of us remember this. And it was a certain moment in which there was openness about this phenomenon that's kind of closed up again. But we know this is a real phenomenon. And guys like Maltsev, back in 1990, there was a UFO encounter near Moscow that involved a Russian interceptor trying to deal with this object that then turned around and started chasing the interceptor. And this is seen by hundreds of witnesses, military. They took photographs, which we've never seen to this day. We know they were taken. The object did S maneuvers horizontally and vertically. Really amazing. And Maltsev said, look, whatever this is, there is no known technology that can do this. The best thing that American skeptics can do with statements like that is say, that's just Soviet propaganda. But this is a real thing that happened. The Moscow UFO sighting was real. It happened in March of 1990, and that statement was real. So Russia has had its encounters. We know that they have a large infrastructure to deal with this. Next slide, please. China's a little harder for me. That's a picture of Dr. Sun Shi. I met him once. He was at the citizen hearing on disclosure. He's one of the better, maybe the best known Chinese UFO researcher. He was actually the Spanish translator for Mao Zedong back in the 70s. So Sun, there's an interview with him on the web with the group Open Minds, based out of Phoenix, where he's speaking in Spanish because he doesn't speak English. And Antonio Huneeus, who's a longtime researcher living in the States, he's from Chile originally, translated the Spanish into English for Alejandro Rojas, who was asking questions in English. And it's a little convoluted, but you can listen to it. What he said in that interview, we don't have a lot about China. After Mao died, there was a lot of relative openness of UFOs. There was a researcher by the name of Paul Dong. I think he is deceased. He wrote some very good books on Chinese UFOs. Sun Shili's talked about it, and there are Chinese researchers in China. There are lots of PhDs. They're looking into this. There's not enough communication that we have with them. What he talked about is that there definitely are encounters with China. There was a border incident, a very dramatic one in 1999 involving a UFO that got Chinese authorities very concerned. And he believes that there was a possible crash retrieval of a UFO way back in 1951. China's infrastructure in 1951 was not advanced. It was very primitive. But he believes, he doesn't know. He thinks that there was such an event. And according to him, the Chinese military don't know if UFOs are a threat. I don't know how much he knows about this. I mean, he's very well established. Basically, China's a black hole for me, hopefully not forever on this. Next slide. Yeah. So regarding China and Russia, this is now my take on it, my analysis. I think that for both of those nations, UFO disclosure is a very tricky proposition. For the one, I talked about the energy paradigm. I am of the opinion that a disclosure would affect our energy paradigm. I don't see how it can't, to be honest with you. These objects are not petroleum-based. I don't see any evidence for that they are. So it implies a post-petroleum paradigm. Russia in particular, I mean, everything that's going on in the Middle East has to do with natural gas. No one talks about it, but that's the case. Russia's economy is totally dependent on that as an export. There's a lot tied in here in the global energy infrastructure for both of these nations. And I'm sure that they're both looking at non-hydrocarbon-based energy sources, but I don't know how far they've gone. And disclosure would be just as disruptive for China and Russia as it would be for any of the other Western nations. So I see a lot of hesitation, and particularly someone like Putin, who is the ultimate cautious diplomat. This is how I read him anyway. He's not someone who just jumps into things willy-nilly. U.S. will accuse him of all kinds of things, none of which are true. He's in reality he's like, in my take, he's the grown-up in the room of screaming children who doesn't do rash things. Same with China. Both of those foreign policies. China is very assertive in its foreign policy these days, but rash, reckless, not in my view. I don't think either of those nations are looking to be radical or revolutionary in their foreign policy or in their domestic policy. So I think that mitigates against a disclosure. I do see a possibility. I mean, if the U.S. secret war against Putin pushes him to the wall, would he do something dramatic like release a secret that would be damaging to the U.S., like the UFO secret? All I can do is speculate. I don't really know. I might be more inclined to think he would, because he probably knows something or two about 9/11, and I think that would be a disruptive thing. But I don't really know. I don't know. My attitude about Russian or Chinese disclosure is that they are wild cards. They're not under U.S. control, although it's very obvious both of those countries, especially Russia, have Western factions within them. But that doesn't, my brain just shut off for a second. I need more coffee. But they are independent of Western control. They are wild cards to that extent, but I do see them both currently as cautious players on the global stage. So I'm just not seeing a disclosure right now. Next slide. So what do I have here? Right, so I say it's possible that Russia or Chinese will do it. I would prefer, actually, that Russia or Chinese would do it ahead of the United States. In fact, I gave an interview earlier this year, and I kind of came up with this off the cuff, but I'm actually glad I said it. I was asked by the interviewer, do I think Obama would disclose to, as part of his legacy, to beat out, the Russians or the Chinese? And I realized, I thought, wow, I really hope that the Russians or Chinese disclose ahead of Obama or any American president. I actually really do. Because it occurred to me that what the United States has become, it breaks my heart because I'm a great student of American history and I believe in the American ideals. I'm actually one of those people. I think America has betrayed every single principle it's ever stood for. And for the United States now to do a disclosure, it would be like Darth Vader disclosing. I mean, there's got to be lies and spin and propaganda and something bad. Really, I mean this, something bad coming out of a U.S. disclosure. People talk about Project Bluebeam, this alleged alien invasion as a psych job on us to create a global totalitarian state. That's not my concern. My concern is not a fake alien invasion, which I have a very difficult time seeing that being pulled off. But I don't have a hard time seeing disclosure itself being a psych job on us to create that totalitarian state. I'll explain why a little later in this lecture. And I think that the U.S. is just the nation to do it. And I'm a little bit concerned that they may. Next slide. So let me leave UFOs for a moment. I'm going to go into just politics and geopolitics and then tie it all back. So what is our global elite really looking to do? There is a global elite, and they have a plan. That's their plan. They want the whole planet. They want to own every single thing. This is what I said earlier. They want to own all the water, absolutely. They want all the minerals. They want all the food, which is going to be genetically modified and patented and owned by them. And you're going to pay for it. We're going to pay for it. It's called globalization. It's called a TPP and TTIP and CETA and TISA and all of the transnational trade agreements that are being covertly and overtly shoved down our throats right now. Financial control, surveillance control, all of it. You can all see this. We can all see that is the direction we are going. Here in Australia, over in the US, over in Europe, and France has become a shadow of what it has been with its basic it's all but in martial law right now in France. And a lot of the other European countries are looking at the same thing. It's all going away right before our eyes. Next slide. In the US, this is what's happening in my country. I don't know how it is in Australia. Middle class is being disemboweled. It's horrifying. I've seen this. I live in a little town, city of Rochester, New York, right across the lake from Canada. I've seen it over the last 25 years. We had Eastman Kodak once upon a time. Kodak just went poof, it's gone. Now that's partly just digital age and Kodak didn't keep up, but I watched it. I watched the deindustrialization. I've watched how the globalization, first NAFTA back in the 90s and all the way through, have contributed toward the loss of what we once called the middle class. It's going away. And, we're, what is that number? 29% make more than $50,000. Most people are making much, much less than that. What do I have here? Oh, yeah, 38% of Americans make less than $20,000 a year. It's not a lot of money, even US dollars, not a lot. And then we're looking in the future. Not just globalization, but the so-called robo-apocalypse. That's a real word. And again, it's not the Terminator coming to kill you. It's automation taking your jobs away. It's happening everywhere. And I really wonder, how will people survive? Well, a lot of people wonder this. And in this world, which is becoming increasingly unstable, with a greater and greater restive population, what is the future? Next slide. Oh, so let me go into wealth. In the US, we talk about the 1% of wealth owners. Well, actually, what I really want to look at is the top 0.01%. They own 22% of national wealth in the US. So in a room of 100 people, if there were $100, one guy would own 42 of those dollars, but 1/10 of those people, 1/10 of one person would own 22 of those dollars. That's America today, and that's really the pattern everywhere you go. In that society, by the way, ask yourself, that's a society that's got a political system, it's got a media, it's got an economy, all the things that make it go. Who's in the best position to manipulate those institutions? Well, that's a question that answers itself. So in that type of world, what we're moving to, where are we headed? Next slide. I think this is the graphic I wanted. Yeah, that's the graphic. That's Seattle 1999. That's what we're moving toward increasing. It's actually happening practically every week. It just never gets reported. Riots and demonstrations, anti-globalist demonstrations. In Seattle in 1999, this is actually a high point in American history. This is the WTO protests, the World Trade Organization. And what happened in late 1999, the World Trade Organization met in Seattle to enact more pernicious, evil, anti-human decisions, to continue with the disembowelment of the United States and the Western world. And people had a chance to protest and organize, and they did. They shut the city down. They actually were so good they prevented the attendees from entering the building for 4 days. The WTO could not convene, basically, not very well. And tear gas didn't work, pepper spray didn't work. It was amazing. Of course, what we saw was about a year and a half later, 9/11 came, and down comes the hammer. And people in my country learned, better duck my head and not speak out. Because now if you go to a protest, your face is triangulated and photographed, and you go to a database, and you live in a fear of intimidation. But this is the future. So keep going. Next slide, please. So I'm going to skip a little bit past this. What's their goal? A new system of royalty. I kind of talked about this. Formalize a breakaway financial structure. Breakaway civilization is more than just technology as I originally conceived it. It's money. It's breaking away from our laws that we create, their own laws. The end of nations, we're seeing it. Greece, my God, with Greece, with friends like Greece, who needs enemies? I mean, with the friends of Greece, they don't need enemies. They're being robbed blind. They're being fleeced. Ukraine, same story. Syria, oh my God. I could talk all day about Syria. The basic story with Syria, the reason practically no Americans understand what's happening in Syria is because the United States has destroyed it. And they'll never hear the truth. What happened was the U.S. decided to take out Libya, the wealthiest, most prosperous nation in Africa, where women could wear what they want, free health care, free housing for the poor in Libya. Nice place. More local democracy than we have in each of our countries, probably. Lots of gold. Intelligently managed resources. They were about to roll out a gold-based dinar, however, that was a threat to the system. And Sarkozy and Cameron and Obama and Hillary Clinton, front row center, wanted to take that nation down, and they did. They destroyed Libya, which will never recover in our lifetime, probably. It's a smoking, heaping wreck of a nation now. Thanks, Obama. Thanks, Hillary. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Sarkozy and Cameron. They took it down, and then they moved into Libya. What happened at Benghazi, by the way, in 2012, this is one thing that the Republicans in my country are they've gone off their meds, those people. They don't understand. They're upset because the U.S. allowed our ambassador to get killed there. Well, sorry, but that guy was kind of a scumbag. Why? I don't mind saying this publicly. He gets brought into Libya in 2011 to do regime change. He succeeds. He's CIA operative. Christopher Stevens. He immediately starts overseeing gun running from Libya to where? Guess where? Turkey, to the head-shopping jihadists there and who were going into Syria to destabilize that country. And then he gets killed. By whom? I don't know. I'm guessing Gaddafi loyalists, probably. We don't really know. That's the story of Benghazi, and you never hear about that in the U.S. or really anywhere. So with that type of a system, this is what we're doing. We're destroying entire nations right before our eyes. I didn't mean to go off-road there, but I feel like, the story of Syria, the story of Libya, this is something that Americans, they don't talk about it. It bothers me. It bothers me that we can destroy entire nations and not have a national conversation about it. There will be a day when we my country, has to be held accountable for this. And I don't know how or when that's going to happen, but it has to happen. Anyway, this is the world we're moving into. It's a war. It's a war by the U.S. and its EU, IMF, allies, and vassal states to take over everything, because they're the tool used to do it. They got the best military to do it, and they're doing it. Okay, next. Next slide, thank you. Oh yeah, so now let's segue back to the UFO phenomenon. These elites, I talked in the last lecture a little bit. I'd read Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of the Ages. It's a great book. I do believe that the global elite, if we want to call them that there are factions that know certain things that are off the map, that are not conventional, esoteric, let's say. You know, there's a lot of talk about whether the elites are doing satanic rituals, all of these awful, you can find a lot of the information out there. I don't know for sure, but I don't doubt a thing. There is a Bohemian Grove, after all, in California, where they do some very bizarre satanic seeming rituals. This stuff leaks out. You know, the UK just recently had their scandals about some pedophilia and Satanism and things like this. It leaks out periodically. There's a very dark side, it seems to me, to what is going on at the very top of our power structure. And if this is anything to do with their esoterica, well, I do wonder. They have access to secret technology? Yes. Pretty confident about that certain circles do within the black budget world. Do they understand ET implications? I believe that they do, a few of them. And what's their relationship? This I don't know. Are they vassals? Are they, is it like a Hollywood movie and they're secretly fighting, you know, organizing? I somehow doubt that. There's different permutations, possibilities. But this is what's happening. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through a couple of different disclosure scenarios with you. Again, I wrote After Disclosure a few years ago, and that was actually one of the four scenarios that I'm going to put forth now. And I did not write about this scenario at the time. Part of it was that, well, I co-authored the book, and I had a very kind of an optimistic co-author, and I liked him. He's a great guy, Bryce, but I actually don't share some of the optimism. I'm a little more dark in my view of things, I hate to say. And I see this maybe as the front runner. Sorry, I think Fascist Disclosure maybe is the front runner of the four. Next slide. So let's talk about Fascist Disclosure. So where we're at, you've kind of seen my little geopolitical analysis. We're in a race. It's us against our handlers, our elite. So what I mean is, we've got a couple of things going for us. We have the web. The last 20 years, World Wide Web has revolutionized our consciousness, our way of communicating with each other. We've had social media for about a decade. Skype. We have an amazing way now of sharing information. The Pirate Bay. It's incredible. It's incredible, really. Things that were totally unforeseen one generation ago. We've got it now. And that gives us power. Now, the solution to that problem, because that is a problem from the point of view of those people who are at the top of our food chain, is, well, we have to control the web. Let's turn the web into TV. Let's commercialize it. Let's, you know, end net neutrality, which is a big issue in the U.S. And at some point, they're going to try to take it down. So that's one danger. Another problem is sharing, this is related to the web, sharing new ideas and new technologies. One of my fantasies, I can't let this one go, is some smart person comes up with a free energy device that's about, you know, yay big, you can hold in your hands. And then they do a nice thing. They upload the CAD version of it to the web. And on the next generation of the Pirate Bay, you can download that. And then on your next generation or third generation 3D printer, you can create it. I don't think that's impossible. Not at all. And if it does happen in the next decade, that would be a definite game changer in global power in general. It would give us, that's just one thing that could change global politics quickly. And could it happen? Yes, it absolutely could happen. There are other things that I'm sure I can't even conceive of, that new technologies, new communications would allow us, vis-a-vis the power elite, to stop the trend toward global fascism. Now, on the other side of it, you know, that's our part of the race. Their part of the race is to get there, to have total control over the whole system before we can do that. That's why I believe there's a rush to put through these transnational trade agreements that nail down intellectual property rights and you know, the whole global surveillance system that's going into place now to monitor us. I think this is what's actually happening. So who's going to get to the finish line first? I don't know. I don't know. But that's what's good. That's the real issue of our era, in my opinion. Another problem, you know, is that we, because of the disemboweling of the Western middle class, because it's not just the U.S., it's everywhere, I think, is an increasingly restive population. People are unhappy with the way things are going. Well, how do you control those people? That's easy. You create a police state, and you surveil them, and you intimidate them 24/7. You frighten them. And you distract them, too, with video games and virtual reality and all of that stuff. So you do both. And we're looking at that happening as well. Next slide, please. So, oh, yeah, let me talk about this briefly. So I'm actually working on a book right now that is not Volume 3 of UFOs in the National Security State, if you want to ask. I will get that done, I swear. But I'm working on a different book right now, which is not UFO related. It is a history of false flag operations and covert ops and regime change. And I hope to have that done in 2017. Actually, I guess I'll take a moment to mention as well that I just got a green light from what is known as Gaia TV. Some of you may have heard of it, to host my own show there on false flags and covert operations, and I'm in the process of putting that together now. So I think we're looking at 15 episodes for hopefully the first of many seasons. It's a lot of work. I'm doing it now, but that's also my book. And in that book, I've developed a kind of an analytical framework about false flags. And I consider false flags, if you don't know what a false flag is, so that would be like if an intelligence agency or a government does something really terrible, like blow up buildings and kill people, and then blame it on another group, like, oh, say, terrorists. A lot of that going on in our world today. And what I believe is that false flags, I see them as part of a propaganda spectrum. That's what I call it here, a propaganda system. And it goes through different layers. False flags are the most intense form of propaganda, but they're not the only form of propaganda. What I see is what I call cultural values. Cultural distractions are next. Cultural values would be like in the U.S., you know, you go to elementary school and you'd pledge allegiance to the flag. I hand over the heart, I pledge allegiance. And all of the things that we go through in our societies that make us good citizens and obedient citizens. Those aren't all bad things, but they do kind of create a system of conformity and, right, social cohesion. That gets the ball rolling. Then the next level of propaganda would be cultural distractions, like the Kardashians, like football games, like all that stuff that just keeps us off our game. When the world is being stolen from underneath our feet by a few people, your job is to look over here at the football game or Dancing with the Stars. Be happy, just zone out. That's great. That's what your job is. Look at this little trinket over here. So that accounts for the distraction for 95% probably of our lives. But then there are those people who want to act like they're informed. In the US, they'll watch CNN or read the New York Times and then become hopelessly forever distracted and confused and never understand a thing, because those are propaganda systems that are designed for that purpose. By the way, one of the new WikiLeaks that just came out showed absolute clear collusion between CNN and the Democratic National Committee. I don't know if you heard about this. I mean, we all kind of knew this, but it was very, very obvious that, you know, what's supposedly going as a independent news organization is anything but. We know this. Anyway, so that is the third level of propaganda, is news-controlled media. Spin, lies, a lot of lies are very underrated. But then beyond that, stronger medicine is sometimes needed to keep people in line, and that's when you get into covert operations, provocations. It seems to me like almost every single G20 meeting that exists these days, and I mean literally every single one, has police provocations that are there to incite greater violence in the riots to discredit them and to justify police repression over the groups. In the U.S., we had a long history of this, in the 1950s and 60s, the COINTELPRO under J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, where they infiltrated the Black Panthers, Students for Democratic Society, which, they were working for peaceful, progressive change. They were infiltrated, incited to violence, discredited. It's all out in the open. We know this. A long, glorious history of the United States. It's everywhere. So that's the next level. And then beyond that, I call shock doctrine opportunism. If you read, there's a great book by the writer Naomi Klein, American, called The Shock Doctrine. And what she says is globalization, neoliberalism, is fundamentally an anti-human program. I totally agree with her there. And to implement it, because it's really ruled by corporations, to implement this, she argues they only can do it by trauma, by shock. She got the phrase from the U.S. military, which talked about shock and awe. We're going to shock and awe. We're going to obliterate the enemy into submission. We're going to shock them and awe them. Wow, that's American military strategy. Well, she argued it's not just international, it's how they rule domestically. She looked at Hurricane Katrina in the U.S., which just really damaged New Orleans. She looked at 9/11, which she didn't look at a false flag. She didn't see that that way. She just saw these horrible traumatic things in which people are bereft and they're traumatized, looking to the government for solutions, and that is when, as she argues, the solutions are rolled out. Corporate domination of New Orleans or the national security apparatus after 9/11 and so on. So they wait for horrible events to happen and in an opportunistic way, essentially take advantage of it. I agree with that, but I go one step further. Next slide. And I argue that beyond that are actual false flags. In other words, in which it's not simply waiting for something to happen, but making that thing happen. And that is a false flag. And not to get too derailed onto it, but I believe that we are in an era of false flags. That will be the thesis. That is the thesis of my forthcoming book. I think it'll be out in 2017. And I will try to explain why. I'll have roughly about 100 events that I think are likely false flags. False flags are harder to research than UFOs, by the way, because a good false flag is a very good covert op, and it's very difficult now to prove. But there are proven false flags. We have them. And for the record, false flags are officially in the playbook of the U.S. military and have been officially in the playbook of the CIA for many years. They're just called black psyops, but they are false flags. It's the same thing. So I will argue why we are in an era of false flags, but that's a little bit, we don't need to go into that here. So next slide, please. Thank you. And now back to Hillary and Jimmy Kimmel. So I think we're still onto fascist disclosure. This is scenario number 1. This is the longest one for me to explain. So let me just take this full circle. So if we're moving toward an era of really total global control. How else do we put it? So in such an era where everything has been achieved in terms of control, if they win that foot race, in other words, if we don't win it, we're looking toward right now a current rebranding of UFOs, potentially. I mentioned this before, from UFO to UAP, to soften the impact of disclosure. Next slide. Which will allow them to maintain total control. Now, in other words, next slide. I should redo some of these slides. So the end game, I kind of talked about this earlier with the technology. Advanced artificial intelligence, quantum computing, complete DNA control, superpowers, organic 3D, all of this, a class-based transhumanism. This is the end game. If they achieve this in a total control system, I should have put the Hillary slide a little later. Next slide. Then, I think, only then, will there be a voluntary form of what we would call disclosure. In my view, I see no motivation otherwise. In other words, right now, I see zero motivation for the U.S. White House to disclose any truth about UFOs. I respectfully have to disagree with my friend Grant Cameron or Stephen Bassett or anyone else who believes that it's going to happen. I don't believe it. And not until this whole system is nailed down, and it's not nailed down yet. But when or if it happens, then yes. Then they'll say, oh yeah, we've got black triangles, and go on, next slide. And, oh yeah, that's a bit of a strong graphic, but, and then, you know, when we're zombied out in a total 24/7 virtual fascist mind job, then yeah, you know, if those people wanting to run our world are confident that they have total control over the whole narrative, then and only then do I believe that there will be a voluntary disclosure. Because I mean, the thing is, you can't keep this secret forever. It really will be difficult. We're jumping over ourselves over and over again, revolutionizing our society. I do believe it would be very difficult ultimately to keep the secret completely buried. So again, as I said earlier, the best way to keep a secret is to pretend to share it. The way I see the whole disclosure scenario is there's mountains of classified data on this subject that are held. And how hard do you think it would be for the US to take a sliver of that mountain? True information, it would be true, but it would be a sliver. And you release that, and you use that to promote your agenda. And that actually is what I think is the most likely scenario. That's why I look at disclosure as a potential false flag. I mean, in the sense of very, very selectively spinning the reality of this grand phenomenon, and you give up a little bit of that secret as a way to manipulate the subject and hopefully nail it down for another several more generations. And then, you know, as we keep moving into the future, I'm assuming that it's a flexible game as to how to keep the truth hidden as much as possible. So that's my vision of how they see disclosure, their preferred disclosure. Next slide. So let's move into disclosure scenario number 2, which I call premature disclosure. Sounds a little naughty, doesn't it? I didn't mean to disclose yet, sorry. So this was basically the theme of After Disclosure, which I don't have any copies here, unfortunately, but it's on Amazon. So next slide. You can see what I think it looks like by that graphic. Premature disclosure, I think, is going to be very messy if it happens. Something unexpected happens. Okay, mass sighting that cannot be explained away, a leak, maybe a WikiLeaks type of event, maybe something like that. Or maybe Russia does it, after all. Maybe Putin just throws it out there, throws a wrench into the system. Or here's a possibility. The U.S. global policy right now just backfires. I mean, America's finances aren't really that good. And let's say there's an economic poof, you know, that goes away. In that type of a situation, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people and a lot of rats jumping off the ship. And in that type of environment, leaks occur. That's what happened to the Soviet Union 25 years ago when that whole ship was sinking. Leaks occurred there. In the U.S. case, there's a lot of potential for some serious UFO-related leaks to occur. And if that happens, well, that may be hard for the U.S. government to spin. They'll try. They will absolutely try to spin the hell out of it. Next slide. You know, the U.S. would still try to maintain control over that. They would almost certainly try to give a self-serving, you know, give up a little bit of the secret, like in fascist disclosure. I'm sure that these are smart people, have got all kinds of contingency plans worked out right now. Try to divert us from the actual truth. The good news for us would be this secret would come out and it would be caught off guard, and it would be very possible that they would not be able to maintain full control over the narrative. There'd be people like us who would, you know, would be listened to, maybe, and would, you know, I remember Occupy Wall Street. Well, what about Occupy Area 51 or Occupy Pine Gap? There's a lot of potential for angry citizens to organize and demand some truth and get some truth out. The absolute possibility. And if that is the case, who knows where we will end up. It would be very messy. Oh, and as I say down here, in the U.S. anyway, this could lead to a lot of other questions. You know, you lied about UFOs. What else have you lied about? 9/11, the JFK assassination. That's still an unresolved, festering wound in the American body politic. Or underground bases, or I mean, a whole chemtrails. There's all sorts of ways people would question the system, and who knows where that would come out at the end. Next slide. So that's the theme of after disclosure, and that's one disclosure scenario. By the way, I wrote that book as a way to, very idealistic, I still stand by it, I guess, as a way to show that disclosure doesn't have to be fascist. There is an opportunity for it, but it would require people to stand up and act and to hold our leaders accountable. Next slide. Next slide. That's the slide. I should have deleted that. That's coming up last. So disclosure scenario number 3, I call insider disclosure. In the U.S. And actually elsewhere, there's a lot of people who've, acquired leaks, given out information. On the left, that's Donald Kehoe. That's CIA Director Rostel Hillenkoetter. That's the former French Minister of Defense Robert Gallet, number 3. In the 1950s, Gallet talked very openly on one occasion about UFO sightings in France. And on the far right, there's Dr. James McDonald, who did a tour here in Australia many years ago, a great American atmospheric physicist. Next slide. This is the citizen hearing on disclosure. On the right, there's me without a beard. On the left is the Disclosure Project. They're into our own century. There have been attempts ongoing. In fact, it's almost like a steady stream of insider testimony and leaks. It's coming out. It hasn't cracked that wall of secrecy fully, but it's happening. Next slide. And now we have currently John Podesta and Tom DeLonge, rock star of Blink-182. I got to meet Tom a couple of years ago. He's a very good guy. These people on your left there are the 3 individuals that Tom DeLonge has been speaking to. 2 are generals. One is, I believe, yes, he's the head of Lockheed Skunk Works right now. And this has come out with WikiLeaks, okay? Tom DeLonge is in communication with John Podesta. That's Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, also Bill Clinton's former chief of staff. John Podesta has been known for many years to have an open interest in UFOs. This is no secret. DeLonge actually was earlier this year, was in deep communication with Podesta and arranging like Google Hangouts and meetings with Podesta and these individuals about the UFO reality, about Roswell, about the transference of secret exotic alien technology to labs at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for a study. And now it's coming out. I don't know where this will end up. I don't know if this is just going to be another leak. It's come out. This has all happened. I don't think there's any likelihood that this did not happen. The question is, will there be sufficient spin and denial just to keep it covered in the establishment, or will it keep spinning out of control and lead somewhere? And that I do not know the answer to that right now. But this is a real possibility, insider disclosure. It could happen. Next slide. That's a nice little picture of Hillary. Will there be a real push for disclosure? Will Hillary disclose the truth about UFOs? I absolutely do not believe it. If she gets elected president tomorrow, I would be willing to bet a lot of money that she won't do it. And if she does, then I'm happy to pay it. But I don't think it would be a truthful disclosure. But I don't think it's going to happen at all. Hillary has talked about UFOs. That doesn't mean she's going to disclose. That doesn't mean she believes in open government. She doesn't. She does not. Podesta talks about open government. I have a hard time believing that. I don't know John Podesta. I've never spoken with him, but I have a hard time believing it. What I don't understand, I admit that I just can't, my mind falters here, is how a seasoned, maybe one of the most seasoned political operatives in the United States, John Podesta, who knows everything. He was chief of staff for Bill Clinton, for goodness sake. How he could not understand how disruptive disclosure would be. He talks about wanting disclosure. I don't know how to believe him. I just don't know how to believe that. I can't think that he's naive. So I don't understand how he thinks that the group that he's working for, the Clintons in this case, are going to be able to spin that without damage to the power structure as it exists. An end to the petroleum-based era, which I think disclosure ultimately would lead to, is an end to the U.S. petrodollar system, which is the foundation for all U.S. destructive, ruinous, murderous foreign policy, which the Clintons have been supporting and are complicit in their whole career. So I don't understand And then the secrecy itself leads to too many disruptions. I don't understand how we can just naively think, oh yeah, disclosure is a great idea. So my admittedly somewhat cynical take on it is that it's all for votes. Because this isn't, 2016 isn't 1996 when UFOs were still sort of like, oh, don't discuss it. I mean, the world is really different now, and it's very much out in the open, much more than it's ever been. And there's a vote there. There is a vote there. And I think they're smart enough to go get it. And that's my take on it right now. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but that's my take on it. Next slide, please. Fourth disclosure, the final disclosure scenario, I call people-driven disclosure. This is the one I believe in. Next, please. It's about that. It's about cultural transformation. If you've read your Marxism, I read this 30, 40 years ago when I was young. Marx talked about a superstructure. I don't remember. So like the political structure was supported by the economic structure. That's how Marx always put it. And when the economics changes enough, the politics change as well. I kind of believe there's a lot of truth to that. In this case, I believe that when the culture changes, the politics will change. In other words, when there's a massive cultural change, that's when things really get moving. The big model that I keep thinking of in the US is gay marriage. 20 years ago, even 20 years ago, gay marriage was like unthinkable. And it had been unthinkable. 100 years ago, a little more than that, a fellow by the name of Oscar Wilde rotted away in a British prison because of his so-called abomination. Come a long way in 100 years. It took several brave people through the 20th century to come out. And there was a lot of cultural resistance. But guess what? We've gone kind of past it, haven't we? So now we're in the 21st century, and it's sort of like normal. And in the space of one generation in the US, opinions on that subject went from gay marriage against was like 70-30 to like 80-24, something like that. I mean, it's just a total sea change like that. So that's what cultural transformation does. And I think that this is what we're doing. We're actually right now with the UFO subject. That's what I felt that the citizen hearing on disclosure was doing most effectively, by getting the YouTube videos out there, by getting all of this data out for people to recognize that this is not a silly topic. And the more that we are brave and willing to discuss this with others, the more that we are participating in that process of change. And there's no question in my mind over the last 20 years that I've been doing this subject, there has been a dramatic change. It's not total, but we're not where we were in the 1990s. I don't believe it at all. I think we've gone a long way. Next slide. So I think what we need, again, this is a political take that I have. To me, I'm not interested in a disclosure within a global police state. I'll opt out, thanks. I'll take a rocket ship to Mars and live there. I don't want to live here in a fascist disclosure. I don't really care, to be honest with you, to know the full secret of the alien phenomenon if I'm living without my own freedom and my own privacy. I don't want it. No thanks. But what I do want is a disclosure by which we reclaim our own political power, our own privacy, and our own freedom. That's what I want. So I feel like, Naomi Klein, back to her again, she talked about learned helplessness in the world that we're living in. It's like all those experiments that you do with rats when you deprive them of the ability to make their own decisions. You give them shocks randomly and so forth. What happens to them? They become depressed. They become listless. That happens to people too. And when we feel like we have no power, we develop helplessness and hopelessness. And to me, honestly, that is the worst thing possible. More than anything else, more than not knowing the truth about UFOs, it's that hopelessness. But I feel that by us regaining the initiative in whatever way that we can, developing our own independence, and being brave and fighting for this, we take back that power and we unlearn the helplessness. We relearn the value of being independent and claiming our own space in this world, independent of a global police state. So what I think we should do is whatever steps that we could do. We're all different. Do various things that we can do to help push that process and give ourselves that sense of empowerment. Whether it's supporting groups that publish information, whether related to UFOs or just related to anything. Support good UFO research. Opt out when feasible, and that's a big, broad statement. For me, I homeschooled my kids. I did. I'm very glad I did it. They're a little too mouthy and independent at times, but I'm very glad that I homeschooled them. They are independent thinkers, and I'm proud of them. There's different things that you can do, whatever that is. But maybe, like, if nothing else, like, let's not buy into the corporate news system and the corporate entertainment system that's all around us, and maybe remind others around us that we don't have to participate in that. I don't watch the American Super Bowl. You know why? Because I don't like to participate in that bullshit pageantry known as the Super Bowl halftime special. I just won't do it. It's a ritual designed, in my opinion, to control and to just take my head out of the game. And I will not ever again watch one, not live. I'll break them down on YouTube the next day. I'll look at them, but I don't want to participate. I'm not involved. I won't ever do it again. Opt out and let other people know that you're independent. I think this is the strongest thing we can do. And also, don't be afraid to talk about UFOs to people. You got jobs. I don't have a job. This is my job, so I can do what I want. So I realize that you're in a different situation. Okay, I get that. But to the extent that you can, be brave. What have you got to lose? Someone's going to think you're a little crazy? Well, I'll tell you something. When you talk about this in an intelligent way, don't overreach and say that you talk to the Pleiadians. Please don't do that. Talk about this in a responsible way. Even if you do talk to the Pleiadians, where's that nice lady? She was here. Okay, whoever. Just like, be smart about it. That's all I'm saying. But be brave. I mean, most people, we don't even have understanding of ourselves, much less somebody else. So if someone wants to criticize you, what does it really matter? This is our life. This is our moment. There's no dress rehearsal. This is it right now. So let's not blow it. Let's just do it. Do it the right way. Be brave. Engage in citizen action where you can. Support a free web and inspire others. Next slide. No matter what disclosure there is, I goofed up. I meant to say disclosure number 4. No matter what disclosure scenario happens, it's not going to be neat. Don't be a utopian. I'm not a utopian. I don't believe, we're going to solve all of our problems. Great. We're human beings. We're not going to solve all of our problems because this is how we are. By the way, a little segue. Remember 2012 when we were supposed to ascend? Remember that? Ascension? Okay, so that was going to happen. I missed the memo, so did you. I don't want to make fun totally. I had some crazy shit happen to me during that week, and I had actually a lot of personal transformation for real. I think the universe was making fun of me because I was making fun of Ascension. I think so. But what I will say is the whole Ascension movement, I actually do look upon as a kind of mass cultural death wish. I'm not joking. I think because our world was so messed up, is so messed up, I believe that there was a kind of a psychological, all right, I have I've got like 1 gram, I don't know, what's 2 ounces of coffee here. How about I put that down? Things are so bad, I think it's very easy for us to kind of go into a Deus Ex Machina mode and think, we'll just be saved. Ascension. What was Ascension? It's like losing your humanity. You transform, your etheric strands of DNA recombine, and you become some etheric body. Really? That's what they call heaven. That's like opting out of the human condition. Bad idea. I think it's a bad idea. We're human beings, so let's not opt out into fantasy land and actually be human beings and fight out our system, our struggles the way we're supposed to. And it's messy, and that's it, Don't be a utopian. You be an idealist, but don't be a utopian. It's just not a good idea, in my opinion. Any disclosure will be messy, because probably any disclosure will not have a gray alien at the podium, so that'll leave people to argue over what we're actually dealing with. There'll only be a partial and deceptive disclosure anyway. So we'll have the culture wars will continue, and we'll probably be arguing. The evangelicals will argue with the tree-hugging New Agers over, is this evil, is this good? There's no and I'm not trying to support or attack anyone here, but I believe there's no bridge wide enough to connect those two points of view. And without proof, they're just going to argue. The skeptics, the scientists, they're going to have their own perspective. Disclosure is not going to resolve it for a long time, in my opinion. There will be truth movements that'll be stronger, and there'll be a long, long time before we get to the bottom of this, in my view. Next slide. So this is a political situation. The cover-up is political, disclosure is political. I'm talking, I'm basically repeating myself. We're dealing with a neo-fascist global political system. I say neo-fascist, new fascism. Not Hitler, not Mussolini, not Stalin. It's something new. And, I believe in disclosure because I believe in breaking this political stranglehold over us. Confronting the world of secrecy, the black budget culture, the breakaway culture, and so forth. Next slide. Oh, yes. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit. I discussed this in the last lecture. I'm almost done here, by the way. I'm running over, sorry. How do we come to grips with these other beings, whatever they are? Next, please, George. I don't think we're ever going to be ready to deal with them. This is my pessimism, but see, here's the thing. Not being ready has never prevented something from happening. Just because you're not ready or I'm not ready doesn't mean it's not going to happen. I was not ready for my first child. Happened anyway. You just have to deal. And disclosure, same thing, probably more so. It's just going to happen. So what I wonder about these other beings is, do they or do they not support our global status quo right now? This I don't really know. You talk to certain contactees who are convinced that these other beings want to help us move on to a higher level of consciousness. Okay. The only problem I have with that is these other beings have been here a long time, and they don't really seem to me to be moving toward affecting political change and transformation. It's very possible I'm not seeing something, I'm missing something here. But I don't know, do they support or not support the status quo, or are they irrelevant to it altogether? Next slide. Yeah, okay. I should probably chill out because I'm really getting pessimistic here. And this is a real downer. Are we outmatched by the situation? One thing that we are outmatched by, I was talking to some researchers earlier here, we have a difficult situation. This phenomenon is not easy to deal with, but we really could be doing better. Globally, just in collecting data on UFOs, if nothing else, just general sighting data. We have no idea how many UFOs are being seen in Australia every year. We have no idea how many are being seen in China. Or if we do, I don't know, or Russia, or any other part of the world. North America's got a couple of websites that collect roughly 15,000 reports a year. 15,000. I don't know that they're all alien craft. I'm sure they're not, but that at least is like a raw data. There's no such collection system anywhere else. So we really could do a lot better, at least in understanding the breadth and quantity of what we're dealing with. There's a lot more we could do. Anyway, to me, the key of this is, oh yes, it's not about being happy. I'd like to be happy, I try to be happy, but it's about learning the truth and reclaiming who we are in the process of this and unlearning that helplessness. Next slide. I think I'm almost done here. Yes, so I hope to thank you very much for your time, and we'll do some questions and answers. Thank you.
Well done. Well, thanks, Richard. That was fantastic, and again, giving us many things to obviously to think about. We have 15 minutes left.
Sorry.
So if anyone has some questions I'd like to ask Richard, we can do a brief Q&A, and I'll ask you to try keep the answers as brief as you can.
Quick questions, quick answers.
Yeah, quick questions, quick answers. If you're ready to go home, that's fine too. And we're going to start doing a bit of pack up because we do have to get out of here. So I'll pass you back to Richard. Yes.
What, if I could ask you, Richard, what's your take on the Mitchell email to Podesta about disclosure?
Oh, the Edgar Mitchell email. Yeah, Edgar Mitchell was in communication with, I think, Dr. Carol Rosen, a friend of mine. I like Carol. And he, I'm trying to remember the details. He told John Podesta about the nature of these other beings as he saw it that were here, that they were peaceful, I believe, and that, gosh, he said that we're dealing with peaceful ETs. I'm trying to remember the rest of that.
Contiguous universe, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I knew Dr. Mitchell. I knew Edgar, and I don't really know that he knew any better than anyone else on what's going on, to be honest with you. Do I think John Podesta knows? Yeah, I have a feeling John Podesta knows quite a lot. I have a feeling he does. I'd have a hard time thinking he doesn't. He's a very, very smart man, and he's been plugged in for a long time. But he's also not part of the military intelligence community as well. So he may have, you know, there's a story that Bill Clinton tried in the 90s to get to the bottom of this and was denied access. And I've heard this a few times. So if Bill Clinton was denied, then maybe John Podesta was denied. And in fact, I spoke to a scientist, a very good source in my opinion, who said to me he chatted with Bill Clinton in the late 90s when Bill Clinton was still president. And he had 5 minutes to talk about UFOs, and this guy's really interested in UFOs. And Bill Clinton apparently said to him, and who knows how truthful he was being, said, yes, I looked into that. I'm sorry to say there's not much I can do about it. Pretty much saying it's out of my hands. So there's a lot I don't know either. I don't know who knows what. And I don't know that Edgar Mitchell really had strong information on this, what he said to Podesta. So, next question. Yes, sir.
What do you think it would take for this topic to be taken seriously in mainstream academia?
That's a great question. A really great shock to the system, to be honest with you. Some really great shock. I don't see academia really moving in this direction at all.
It's a matter of, I mean, are we sort of waiting for the CIA to permit academia to talk about this?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
More of a ground up sort of thing?
Yeah, in my take on academia globally is that it's still very controlled. Most academicians are pretty, I don't mean to be disparaging, but very timid. And you know, if they haven't gotten tenure yet, they're not going to try to rock the boat. I think if the intelligence community gives them permission, but that's basically a top-down decision. I just don't see it coming from academia. They've missed so many opportunities for so many generations. There are younger people, and there are retired people in academia. Like I've spoken to a number of them. They're very interested in this, but they don't speak until they retire. So that tells me there's still a lot of pressure in that system.
Would it be possible to sort of create enough interest? I mean, if you could almost smuggle the issue in through the back door by approaching it in such a way that it is acceptable.
Yeah, they have to be very careful.
Playing down some of the more bizarre aspects and creating enough interest.
And there is a very small academic group that actually is starting to look at the UFO phenomenon in a very careful way. They're not, I'm trying to think of some studies, they're out there, where they look at this in a social phenomenon, and even, I think it's even becoming possible to look at government policy on UFOs. There was a book a few years ago by some people who were kind of quasi-academicians called Governments and UFOs. Michael Swords edited this book. It's a very careful, kind of dry study of the subject, but I could see something like that happening. It'd take a lot of bravery in the field to do it. Any other questions? Yes?
Would you be able to ask anyone who might have experienced?
Repeat that, please.
Can you ask the audience, if anyone, I'm asking you guys now, is
Oh.
there anyone that's experienced any form of communication or...
Okay, right. So if anyone's had an encounter, can we say, with what you might consider a non-human being, is that fair to ask?
Yeah,
Would you, or, well, I'll do UFO sightings separately. So how about beings first? Has anyone had an encounter with what you might consider to be a non-human being? I know it's not an easy question to answer, and not everyone. I saw 1, 2, a few hands are going up. Has anyone seen what they believe is a UFO? A lot more hands. A lot more hands. By the way, how many people have reported what you think is a UFO to some agency, or a very few? A few. Oh, well, okay, a few more. Does that...
I'd like to hear about the experience of someone.
We can't do it tonight. Sorry.
Well, we don't have time, do we?
But, you know, are there local... There's local researchers here. Maybe, you know, in where I live, we have what we call Meetup. Do you have that here? Meetup.com. It's cool. It's really nice. And you can organize where people get together. Whether it's dog grooming or UFOs, it doesn't matter. You can get together and meet every once in a while. Someone organizes it, and or you just do it informally, get together and talk. I think it's a great idea. And in fact, I have a meetup in my city, and we have 50 to 60 people every single month, and we talk about this. And it's great. I get to meet people who are face-to-face who are interested in this, and they get to share information with each other. Any other questions? I saw you, sir, and I'll get you after that. Yeah.
Richard, I recently attended the experience with Buzz Aldrin. And at the end of the seminar, they had a few questions, and there was a 10-year-old child that came up to the stage and said to Buzz, "Oh, do you believe in aliens?"
Yeah.
There was 2 minutes of uncomfortable silence.
Like he was silent for 2 minutes?
Exactly. Yeah, he was silent.
He stood on the stage for 2 minutes and didn't say anything?
Looked at the 10-year-old looked back at him, and it was 2 minutes.
Oh my God! Is this on video anywhere?
And then the week before, I watched the doco called Aliens on the Moon, where Buzz Aldrin was featured quite a lot.
Right.
And was making comments about the phobos.
Yeah, exactly.
On the moon and that sort of thing. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think Buzz Aldrin is kind of a loose cannon. He's in his 80s. What does he care anymore? He's really come out with some statements. He came out with the Phobos statement, which has that huge, like tower-like structure. It does look very odd. And he talked about that in a very enthusiastic way on national television, as if it's not natural. He really was sort of.
He had an astrophysicist friend that was quite high up that could explain it, but he wasn't an expert in that area. That's how he sort of responded to it.
Yeah, but that was after the fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then he also talked about, of course, on the Apollo mission on their way to the moon, that they were followed by an object. And then the next day, he said, "Oh no, I was informed that it was part of the Apollo capsule." But I mean, think about, you go for 40 years thinking about this. Really? So he's kind of a loose cannon, I think. And there's so many Apollo stories about what happened. First of all, there's the whole question: did they land on the moon? And secondly, the question of if they went to the moon, what did they encounter? I kind of like both of these arguments. I think there's a lot of lies and deception that NASA engaged in about that moon program. I'll get to your question 1 second. We're almost done. My suspicion is that they did go, but that what we're told was not true, and that there was a component of some kind of black or a classified landing on the moon. That's my guess. I think we did go, but I don't think that we've been told the truth about it. You had a question, sir?
Yeah, I was just wondering about your personal opinion on Zachariah Sitchin and Willie Price.
Okay. Sitchin was really brilliant. He, of course, wrote about the Anunnaki, the 12th planet. I've read a lot of really devastating critiques of Sitchin's work, to be perfectly honest with you. Even people who were Sitchin's friends have told me a lot of his work was really sloppy. I think probably it was. I don't read the Sumerian tablets. I don't know what to tell you. But my basic take would be this. Let's say Sitchin was exactly right in his translations. And let's say in Sumerian, they talked about the Anunnaki and the manipulation of human beings and so on. What I don't understand is why people today take that as basically like fundamentalist Christians take the literal truth of the Bible. There are such people who take like what the Sumerians told themselves 4,000 plus years